Hello, and welcome to tonight's soothing journey into the past. Whether you're settling in for a cozy night's rest or simply looking to unwind, I'm glad you've chosen to join me on this journey through the annals of history. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share with our community of nocturnal historians where in the world you're tuning in from, along with what time it is for you. It's fascinating to see what far patches of the earth these tales stretch to. And if you enjoy these calm, historical narratives, please consider subscribing to the channel for more soothing stories from the past. Tonight, we'll be delving into a darker chapter of history as we explore some of the cruelest figures from the medieval era. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was a time of great change and upheaval in Europe. It was an age of chivalry and crusades, of soaring cathedrals and sprawling castles. But beneath the veneer of courtly romance and religious piety, there lurked a pervasive undercurrent of brutality and violence. In a world where life was often nasty, brutish, and short, some individuals stood out for their exceptional cruelty, leaving a chilling legacy that echoes through the centuries. From bloodthirsty warlords to ruthless kings and queens, these medieval tyrants wielded power with an iron fist, inflicting untold suffering on their subjects and enemies alike. As we journey back to this tumultuous time, we'll meet some of the most notorious figures of the Middle Ages, exploring their rise to power, their shocking deeds, and the lasting impact they had on history. We'll witness the savage wars and power struggles that shaped the medieval world, and learn about the social and political forces that gave rise to such cruelty. But before we plunge into the dark heart of the Middle Ages, let's take a moment to set the stage. Imagine yourself transported back to a time when life was governed by the rhythms of the seasons and the dictates of the feudal system. A time when the vast majority of people lived in small villages and toiled in the fields, while nobles and knights fought bloody battles for land, honor, and glory. It was a world of stark contrasts and contradictions, where the lofty ideals of chivalry and courtly love coexisted with the grim realities of poverty, disease, and violence. A world where the church held immense power and influence, even as corruption and hypocrisy ran rampant among the clergy. Against this backdrop, the cruelest figures of the Middle Ages played out their grim dramas, leaving an indelible mark on history and the human psyche. So let's dim the lights, get comfortable, and embark on a journey into the darkest corners of the medieval world. But be warned, the tales we'll uncover are not for the faint of heart. Our first stop on this grim tour of medieval cruelty takes us to the kingdom of Wallachia, a small principality in the Balkans that would one day become part of modern-day Romania. It was here, in the 15th century, that one of the most notorious figures of the Middle Ages first rose to power. Vlad III, better known to history as Vlad the Impaler. Born in 1431 into the House of Draculesht, a noble family that had long ruled Wallachia, Vlad's early life was marked by turmoil and tragedy. When he was just a boy, his father was assassinated, and Vlad and his younger brother were taken hostage by the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II, as a means of ensuring the loyalty of Wallachia. During his years as a hostage in the Ottoman court, Vlad was exposed to the brutal methods of Turkish warfare and punishment, including the practice of impalement, which would later become his signature method of execution. Some historians believe that it was during this time that Vlad developed his taste for cruelty and his deep-seated hatred of the Ottomans. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia in 1448, he found his homeland in chaos. The kingdom was beset by rival factions and under constant threat of invasion from the Ottomans and the neighboring kingdom of Hungary. Determined to restore order and assert his authority, Vlad embarked on a reign of terror that would make him one of the most feared and reviled figures of his time. One of Vlad's first acts as ruler was to invite hundreds of nobles and officials to a grand feast at his castle. As the guests dined and drank, Vlad's soldiers quietly surrounded the hall. At a signal from their master, they burst in and seized the unsuspecting revelers, dragging them out to a nearby field where they were all impaled on long, sharp stakes. This brutal act of mass execution was just the beginning of Vlad's reign of terror. Over the next few years, he would become infamous for his sadistic methods of torture and execution, which included impaling, boiling alive, and even forcing people to eat their own severed limbs. Vlad's cruelty knew no bounds. He once had a group of Turkish envoys impaled for refusing to remove their turbans in his presence, and he was known to dine among the impaled corpses of his victims, dipping his bread in their blood. Some accounts even claim that he had a special fondness for impaling pregnant women, leaving them to die slow, agonizing deaths as their unborn children perished inside them. But Vlad's brutality was not just a matter of personal sadism. It was also a calculated political strategy designed to intimidate his enemies and cement his power. By creating an atmosphere of terror and dread, Vlad hoped to deter any would-be challengers to his rule and to make an example of those who dared to defy him. And to a large extent, it worked. During his reign, Wallachia enjoyed a period of relative stability and prosperity, even as its people lived in constant fear of their ruthless ruler. Vlad's reputation as a savage and merciless tyrant spread far beyond the borders of his kingdom, and he became a symbol of the dark side of medieval power. But Vlad's reign of terror was not to last. In 1462, he was captured by the Hungarians and imprisoned for over a decade. When he finally returned to Wallachia in 1476, he found his kingdom once again in turmoil, and he was soon killed in battle against the Ottomans. Despite his grisly end, Vlad's legacy lived on, inspiring countless legends and tales of horror. In the centuries that followed, his name would become synonymous with cruelty and evil, and he would be remembered as one of the most brutal and sadistic figures of the Middle Ages. But Vlad was far from the only cruel and ruthless ruler of his time. The medieval world was full of individuals who wielded power with a savage and merciless hand, from the bloody battlefields of the Crusades to the dark dungeons of Europe's castles. One of the most notorious examples of medieval cruelty was the Crusades, a series of religious wars that raged across Europe and the Middle East from the 11th to the 13th centuries. Launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, the First Crusade was a massive military campaign designed to recapture the Holy Land from Muslim rule and to assert the power and authority of the Catholic Church. But while the Crusades were ostensibly fought in the name of God and the defense of Christendom, they were also marked by incredible brutality and savagery. Crusading armies, made up of knights, soldiers, and even peasants from across Europe, marched across the continent, leaving a trail of destruction and bloodshed in their wake. One of the most infamous episodes of the Crusades was the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, when the Crusaders finally reached their ultimate goal and stormed the Holy City. What followed was a massacre of horrific proportions, as the Crusaders slaughtered thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, sparing neither women nor children. According to contemporary accounts, the streets of Jerusalem ran red with blood, and the stench of death filled the air for weeks afterward. The Crusaders celebrated their victory by looting the city's treasures and desecrating its holy sites, even as the bodies of the dead lay unburied in the streets. The Crusades also unleashed a wave of religious persecution and violence across Europe, as Christians turned on their Jewish neighbors, accusing them of betraying Christ and collaborating with the Muslims. In many cities, Jewish communities were attacked and massacred, their homes and synagogues burned to the ground. One of the most notorious examples of this persecution was the Rhineland massacres of 1096, when crusading mobs swept through the cities of the Rhine Valley, slaughtering thousands of Jews and forcing many others to convert to Christianity at sword point. The Crusades were not the only source of religious violence in the medieval world. In the 13th century, the Catholic Church launched a brutal campaign against the Cathars, a Christian sect that had taken root in southern France. Known as the Albigensian Crusade, this bloody conflict lasted for over 20 years and resulted in the deaths of countless innocents. The Cathars, who rejected the authority of the Catholic Church and embraced a dualistic theology that saw the material world as evil, were branded as heretics and targeted for extermination. The Crusaders, led by the notorious Simon de Montfort, swept through the region, burning villages, slaughtering inhabitants, and forcing the survivors to convert or face execution. One of the most infamous episodes of the Albigensian Crusade was the massacre at Béziers in 1209, when the Crusaders stormed the city and killed everyone inside, including women, children, and priests. When asked by a soldier how to distinguish between the Cathars and the Catholics, the papal legate Arnaud Amalric is said to have replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The cruelty and violence of the Crusades and the persecution of religious minorities were not the only sources of suffering in the medieval world. For ordinary people, life was often brutal and short, marked by poverty, disease, and the constant threat of violence. One of the most gruesome aspects of medieval life was the use of torture and public execution as a means of punishment and control. In a world where the rule of law was often weak or non-existent, those in power relied on terror and brutality to maintain their grip on society. Public executions, often carried out in the most horrific and painful ways imaginable, were a common sight in medieval Europe. Criminals, heretics, and political dissidents were routinely subjected to such grisly punishments as burning at the stake, breaking on the wheel, and hanging, drawing, and quartering. The practice of burning at the stake was particularly widespread, especially for those accused of heresy or witchcraft. The condemned would be tied to a wooden post and surrounded by piles of wood and kindling, which would then be set alight. The victim would be left to die an agonizingly slow and painful death, their screams echoing through the crowds that gathered to watch. The breaking wheel, another common method of execution, was a particularly gruesome and protracted way to die. The condemned would be tied to a large wooden wheel and beaten with heavy clubs or iron bars, shattering their bones and leaving them to die slowly and in agony. This punishment was often reserved for the most serious crimes, such as treason or murder. In England, the punishment for treason was even more horrific. Known as hanging, drawing, and quartering, this grisly execution involved hanging the condemned until they were nearly dead, then disemboweling them and burning their entrails before their eyes. Finally, their body would be cut into 4 pieces and displayed in public as a warning to others. These public executions were not just a means of punishment, but also a form of entertainment and social control. Crowds would gather to watch the gruesome spectacle, jeering and cheering as the condemned met their fate. The authorities used these displays of brutality to strike fear into the hearts of the populace and to assert their power and authority. But even in a world marked by such cruelty and violence, there were some individuals who stood out for their exceptional brutality and sadism. One such figure was King John of England, who ruled from 1199 to 1216 and earned a reputation as one of the most tyrannical and despotic monarchs in English history. John, the youngest son of King Henry II, came to the throne after the death of his brother Richard the Lionheart. He inherited a kingdom that was beset by internal strife and external threats, including a long-running war with France that had drained England's coffers and sapped its military strength. Rather than trying to unite his kingdom and win the loyalty of his subjects, John ruled with a heavy hand, using violence and intimidation to crush any opposition to his rule. He was notorious for his cruelty and his vindictive nature, and he seemed to take a perverse pleasure in inflicting suffering on others. One of John's most infamous acts of cruelty was the alleged murder of his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur, the son of John's elder brother Geoffrey, had a strong claim to the English throne, and many of John's barons supported him as the rightful heir. In 1203, Arthur was captured by John's forces and imprisoned in the castle of Rouen. According to some accounts, John ordered his nephew to be blinded and castrated, a common punishment for political rivals in the Middle Ages. But Arthur's fate was even more gruesome. He was said to have been murdered by John himself, who reportedly stabbed him to death and dumped his body in the Seine. John's cruelty and tyranny eventually led to a full-scale rebellion by his barons, who forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that limited the power of the monarchy and established the principle of the rule of law. But even this historic moment was marked by violence and bloodshed, as John sought to renege on his promises and crush the rebellion by force. In the end, John's reign was cut short by his own cruelty and misrule. He died of dysentery in 1216, reviled by his subjects and remembered as one of the worst kings in English history. But his legacy lived on, a testament to the dark side of medieval power and the depths of human cruelty. The cruelty and violence of the medieval world were not limited to the actions of individual rulers and tyrants. The period was also marked by widespread social and economic inequality, which often erupted into bloody conflict and revolt. One of the most turbulent periods in medieval history was the 14th century, a time of great upheaval and suffering across Europe. The century began with a series of disastrous harvests and famines, which led to widespread hunger and disease. This was followed by the outbreak of the Black Death, a devastating pandemic that killed millions of people and upended the social and economic order. In the wake of these calamities, many peasants and commoners rose up in revolt against their feudal lords and the ruling classes. These uprisings, known as the peasants' revolts, were often brutally suppressed by the nobles and the authorities, who saw them as a threat to the established order. One of the most famous of these revolts was the Jacquerie, which took place in northern France in 1358. The revolt was sparked by the hardships and abuses suffered by the peasants at the hands of the nobles, who were preoccupied with the ongoing war with England and had little regard for the welfare of their subjects. The Jacquerie began as a series of local uprisings, but quickly spread across the countryside, as peasants armed themselves and attacked the castles and estates of their lords. The rebels, known as the Jacques, a derogatory term for peasants, targeted the nobility with particular brutality, killing and mutilating their victims in horrific ways. But the nobles soon rallied and crushed the revolt with even greater brutality. They hunted down the rebels and subjected them to horrific punishments, including torture, mutilation, and execution. Many of the Jacques were hanged or burned alive, while others had their hands and feet cut off as a warning to others. A similar fate befell the participants in the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which was led by the charismatic rebel leader Wat Tyler. The revolt began as a protest against the imposition of a new poll tax, which fell heavily on the poor and working classes. As the revolt spread across southern England, the rebels attacked government officials and tax collectors, as well as the estates of the wealthy and the powerful. They demanded an end to serfdom and the right to fair treatment under the law. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the rebels might succeed in their aims. They marched on London and confronted the young King Richard II, who was forced to negotiate with them and agree to their demands. But the king soon reneged on his promises and ordered the rebels to disperse. In the ensuing clash, Wat Tyler was killed and the rebel army was routed. The authorities then launched a brutal crackdown on the participants, executing hundreds of rebels and subjecting many others to torture and imprisonment. The failure of the peasants' revolts did not put an end to the suffering and oppression of the common people in medieval Europe. but they did serve as a reminder of the deep social and economic inequalities that plagued the period, and of the potential for violent upheaval when those inequalities became too great to bear. The cruelty and brutality of the medieval world were not limited to Europe, of course. In other parts of the world, powerful rulers and conquerors left their own bloody mark on history, carving out vast empires through violence and terror. One of the most notorious of these figures was Timur, also known as Tamerlane, a Turco-Mongol conqueror who ruled over a vast swath of Central Asia and the Middle East in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Timur was a ruthless and cunning warrior who used, continuing the script. But the violence of the Wars of the Roses went far beyond the nobility. The common folk suffered immensely as marauding armies swept across the land, pillaging towns, trampling crops, and press-ganging hapless peasants into service as foot soldiers. Villages were burned, livestock slaughtered, women raped. It was said even the ravens grew fat and content from feasting on the unburied dead. This same vicious cycle played out time and again throughout the Middle Ages. The great game of thrones played by lords and kings, while the lowborn paid the price in blood, hunger, and anguish. The mighty few jostled for crowns and castles with little care for the misery left in their wake. Perhaps no one embodied this callous thirst for power more completely than Cesare Borgia. Born into the scandalous Spanish Borgia dynasty that had fought and bribed its way into the Vatican, young Cesare was named a cardinal by his papal father at the shockingly tender age of the 18th. But the headstrong youth soon cast off his scarlet robes, determined to build a kingdom of his own in the patchwork of city-states and principalities that was Renaissance Italy. Dashing and charismatic, Cesare gathered a formidable mercenary army, winning a fearsome reputation as a brilliant commander and an utterly ruthless one. Friend and foe alike spoke in awestruck horror of his deeds. In one notorious incident, Cesare invited his sister Lucrezia's husband to a cordial meeting, where he had the man seized and strangled to death. No insult or obstacle to Cesare's ambition could be borne. His own brother Juan, seen as a rival, met an equally grim fate, his body dumped unceremoniously into the river Tiber. Like a hawk among squabbling sparrows, Cesare swept through the Romagna region, conquering one small state after another, either by force of arms or duplicitous diplomacy. Opponents who failed to bend the knee met brutal ends: strangulation, stabbing, or a dose of his signature poison, cantarella. Cities that resisted his sieges were subjected to days of rape, looting, and wanton slaughter once the walls fell. So great was the terror preceding his armies that many towns threw open their gates at his mere approach, desperate to avoid a far worse fate. Within a few short years, Cesare had carved out a sizable domain for himself, ruling with an iron fist. He dreamed of uniting all Italy under Borgia dominion. It's no wonder that Machiavelli, in his classic work The Prince, later held up Cesare as a model of the supremely effective ruler, unfettered by tedious morals and qualms. And yet, for all his guile and ruthlessness, Cesare's empire proved as fleeting as any other in that tumultuous age. With his father's death and a new pope on the throne determined to tear him down, Cesare's allies and mercenaries soon melted away. Gravely ill himself, he watched his conquests collapse like an elaborate house of cards, until he was just another landless noble shuttling between courts and jails. At the age of just 31, the once great Cesare met an ignominious end, cut down in some nameless skirmish on a Spanish back road. So it went for so many of history's cruelest figures: a meteoric rise, an all too brief reign steeped in blood and terror, then an abrupt fall into ruin, death, and dark legend. For those they crushed and tormented, it could never be enough to balance the scales. But we can take some cold comfort, perhaps, in the knowledge that the most vicious and ruthless rarely found lasting peace or contentment. Their sins had a way of catching up with them. Across the centuries, the names may change, but the basic character remains the same. The heartless tyrant, the sadistic warlord, the murderous zealot. They are woven like a black thread through the medieval tapestry, these cruelest of the cruel. Vlad the Impaler, Timur, Cesare Borgia, and the rest. They shock us, appall us, but also morbidly captivate us. We see in them the darkest shadows of human nature, what terrible deeds man is capable of when freed from all restraint and mercy. It's a somber lesson the Middle Ages teach us again and again. The ease with which power can corrupt, the savagery that lies coiled in the human heart. For all the knightly valour and stirring piety we rightly celebrate in the medieval world, there is this vein of obsidian, bitter as poison, cold as the grave. The cruelest people in history may be centuries dead and mouldering, but the chilling echoes of their evil linger still. As we ponder their legacies from the safety of our softer modern age, we can breathe a thankful prayer not to live in such harsh times, to have been spared the depredations of the Borgias and Draculas among us. But we would also do well to keep their memory close and guard against their like rising again. The cruelest in history may be gone, but the all too human impulses that created them, the reckless ambition, the pitiless wrath, the gnawing fear that fuels hatred, lie buried not so very deep in us all. So let us take these medieval monsters for what they are, dark warnings from our past, and let us strive, in ways large and small, to be better than our forebearers at their worst, to nurture justice and gentleness, to put compassion before retribution, to stay the hand of needless violence. For only in this way can we seek to tame the cruelest of our all-too-human race. Throughout the turmoil of the Wars of the Roses in 15th century England, perhaps no figure looms as darkly in the popular imagination as King Richard III. The last king from the House of York, Richard's reign was brief but notorious, cut short by his death in battle against Henry Tudor. But it was the sinister rumours about Richard that truly blackened his name for centuries to come. Born into the royal family, Richard grew up during the early clashes between the rival houses of York and Lancaster. As a young man, he supported his elder brother Edward as he claimed the throne, becoming King Edward IV. Richard proved himself a capable military commander, playing a key role in the victories that won Edward the crown. When Edward died unexpectedly in 1483, Richard was named Lord Protector, ruling in place of Edward's young sons. But Richard's ambitions reached higher still. In a shocking move, he declared his nephews, the so-called princes in the Tower, illegitimate and unfit to rule. Richard swiftly had himself crowned as King Richard III instead. Not long after, the two princes mysteriously vanished within the Tower of London, never to be seen again. Rumours swirled that Richard had the boys murdered to secure his own claim to the throne. Whether Richard was truly guilty of this crime is a mystery that endures to this day. What's certain is that the accusation cast a grim shadow over his reign from the start. Richard faced threats and uprisings from those who challenged his legitimacy. All the while, Henry Tudor, the last hope of the Lancaster cause, gathered support abroad for an invasion. In an England weary of dynastic strife, Richard's suspected ruthlessness cost him dearly in loyalty and goodwill. When Henry Tudor finally landed with an army in 1485, nobles defected to join his cause in droves. Richard met Henry in a fateful battle at Bosworth Field. Bravely fighting to the end, Richard ultimately fell in the thick of combat, becoming the last English king to die in battle. With Richard's death, the Wars of the Roses at last came to a close. Henry was crowned King Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty that would rule England for over a century to come. But while the Middle Ages drifted into history, Richard III's dark legend only grew. In the famous Shakespeare play bearing his name, Richard is memorably portrayed as a conniving, bloodthirsty hunchback. His final, despairing cry of, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," ringing through the ages. Though a grave injustice, if untrue, the image of Richard as a child-murdering tyrant became indelibly etched into popular memory. His story endures as a chilling example of how history can damn a medieval ruler, whether deservedly or not. In the centuries since, some have sought to rehabilitate Richard's reputation, arguing the evil deeds were mere Tudor propaganda. Yet the shadow remains, a testament to the abiding fascination with the cruel and mighty figures who haunt the Middle Ages. As we continue our journey through the cruelest people in medieval history, we turn now to the Italian peninsula, and a man whose ruthless exploits were immortalized by one of history's most famous political philosophers. Cesare Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, born into the wealthy and powerful Borgia family. From a young age, Cesare was marked for great things, first in the Catholic Church, where his father made him a cardinal, and later as a feared military leader. But Cesare's ambitions were always entwined with those of his tempestuous family. His father Alexander, born Rodrigo Borgia, schemed and bribed his way into the papacy, securing wealth and influence for his children. The Pope made Cesare's younger brother Giovanni a duke and captain of the papal armies. The handsome Giovanni was his father's favourite, a fact that bred deep resentment in Cesare. That resentment boiled over into lethal violence in 1497. One night, Giovanni's body was fished out of the Tiber River, riddled with stab wounds. Cesare was widely suspected of having his own brother murdered, eliminating a hated rival for their father's favour. From then on, no one would underestimate how far Cesare was willing to go in his relentless pursuit of power. With Giovanni dead, Cesare persuaded his father to release him from his position as cardinal, freeing him to become a military leader like his brother had been. Backed by the Pope's wealth and authority, Cesare set out on a ruthless campaign of conquest, determined to carve out a kingdom for himself in the patchwork of city-states and principalities that was Renaissance Italy. At the head of a papal army, Cesare swept through central Italy with brutal efficiency. Towns that resisted were sacked and their inhabitants massacred. Powerful local lords who defied him were imprisoned or assassinated. The Romagna region fell before Cesare like ripe fruit from a tree, as the Borgia serpent on his banners struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. In the space of just a few years, through a combination of cunning diplomacy, lightning-fast sieges and sheer ruthless intimidation, Cesare had conquered a substantial territory, answerable only to himself. He governed his new lands with an iron fist, crushing any hint of rebellion and rewarding loyalty handsomely. The bloody trail Cesare blazed across Italy made him feared and hated in equal measure. But his cold effectiveness as a ruler was undeniable, so much so that the great Renaissance writer Niccolò Machiavelli later held up Cesare as a model for his famous work, The Prince. For Machiavelli, Cesare embodied the ideal prince, one who could seize and hold power through a calculated balance of force, cruelty, and shrewd cunning. Cesare showed that in the cutthroat arena of Renaissance politics, only the most ruthless could rise to the top and stay there. Yet even for a man as formidable as Cesare Borgia, fate could be a fickle thing. His conquest depended heavily on the papal support of his father. When Pope Alexander VI died suddenly in 1503, the Borgia power structure crumbled virtually overnight. Cesare himself fell ill, his enemies moved against him, and his lands slipped from his grasp as quickly as he had won them. Exiled and landless, Cesare schemed to make a comeback, but his luck had finally run out. In 1507, he was killed in a minor skirmish, an inglorious end for a man who had once seemed poised to dominate all of Italy. The meteoric arc of Cesare Borgia blazed brightly across the Renaissance sky before sputtering out, a testament to the fleeting nature of power seized through cruelty and guile. Yet Cesare's legacy would long outlive him. His brutal methods and calculating pragmatism shocked and enthralled the princes of his day, and inspired Machiavelli's enduring masterpiece of statecraft. For centuries, Borgia would remain a byword for the ruthless exercise of power, a reputation Cesare himself might well have savoured. In the age of the Italian city-states, riven by feuds and conspiracies, it was men like Cesare Borgia who epitomised both the cruelty and the precarious brilliance of an infamous era. As we contemplate the sweep of medieval history, it can be all too easy to lose sight of the individual human lives caught up in the tide of great events. The cruelty of the age fell most heavily on the common folk, the peasants and townsfolk whose hardscrabble existences could be upended in an instant by the vagaries of weather, disease, or the violence of their betters. In the 14th century, life for the medieval peasantry took a nightmarish turn, as a convergence of catastrophes plunged Europe into a prolonged crisis. The warming climate that had prevailed for centuries gave way to the cooling and unpredictable weather of the Little Ice Age. Crops failed year after year as drought, floods, and bitter winters laid waste to fields. With food supplies dwindling, famine stalked the land. The gnawing spectre of starvation was soon joined by an even more terrifying visitation: the Black Death. This virulent strain of bubonic plague, borne by rats and fleas from the trade ports of Italy, scythed through Europe's weakened population like a merciless reaper. Festering boils, agonizing pain, and delirium were the plague's hellish hallmarks. It struck rich and poor alike, but it was the undernourished peasants, huddled together in unsanitary hovels, who died in the greatest droves. Between famine and plague, Europe's population plummeted by as much as a half in the span of just a few decades. The medieval world was accustomed to death, but the sheer scale and indiscriminate scourge of the Black Death shook society to its very foundations. Fields lay abandoned, towns and cities emptied. The Catholic Church, whose priests perished by the thousands even as they administered last rites to the dying, struggled to explain a calamity of such monstrous proportions. Some saw the plague as God's judgment on a sinful world, but such cold comfort rang hollow to those who had seen their loved ones, their children, succumb to an agonizing end. In the wake of such devastating upheaval, medieval society began to fray at the seams. With the ranks of the peasantry so drastically thinned, those who survived found themselves in a rare position of leverage. Desperate landlords were forced to pay higher wages to attract enough laborers to work their fields. Some peasants began to question the rigid feudal hierarchy that had held sway for centuries, a system that now seemed woefully inadequate in the face of such terrifying adversity. Simmering resentments boiled over into outright rebellion. In France, the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 saw peasants take up arms against the nobles who had oppressed them for so long. The rebels burned castles and manor houses, exacting a brutal revenge for generations of mistreatment. But the nobles struck back with even greater savagery. The revolt was crushed, its leaders hunted down and executed in the thousands. The Jacquerie passed into legend as a chilling example of the fury of the downtrodden and the pitiless retribution of the powerful. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 met a similar fate. Sparked by a hated poll tax and long-standing grievances, the rebels converged on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler. The boy King Richard II met with Tyler and seemed to agree to the rebels' demands. But it was a ruse. Tyler was stabbed to death in a heated altercation with the king's retinue. Deprived of their leader, the rebel armies disbanded and scattered. In the weeks that followed, Richard's men hunted down the ringleaders and made brutal examples of them, a grim epilogue to a fleeting dream of common justice. The peasant revolts of the 14th century were ultimately doomed, crushed by the combined might of crown, church, and aristocracy. But they stand as powerful testaments to the human toll of the Middle Ages and the enduring cruelty of a world where the lowly could suffer and perish in the uncaring sweep of disaster and repression, in the face of famine, plague, and the fury of their masters. The common folk of medieval Europe endured with a tenacity as remarkable as it was tragic. Their struggles, though often lost to history, remain a poignant reminder of the human cost of the age's upheavals. As the Middle Ages wound to a close, the world was changing, but the spectre of cruelty remained a constant shadow. While Europe began to shake off the cobwebs of feudalism and look towards the Renaissance, in Asia, a conqueror arose whose thirst for blood and dominion knew no bounds. Born in 1336 in what is now Uzbekistan, Timur, known to history as Tamerlane or Timur the Lame, seemed an unlikely candidate for greatness. But this Turco-Mongol warrior king would carve out an empire that rivaled that of his idol and predecessor, Genghis Khan. And like the great Khan, Timur would leave a trail of slaughter and devastation in his wake that would make his name a byword for cruelty. Timur's early life was a hard one, a constant struggle in the ruthless world of steppe politics. Scars from arrow wounds and a shattered hip left him with a pronounced limp, but also a burning drive to prove himself through force of arms. As a young man, he earned a fearsome reputation as a cunning tactician and merciless raider, securing a band of fiercely loyal warriors through his audacious exploits. With this army at his back, Timur embarked on a relentless campaign of conquest that would span decades and shatter kingdoms. He swept through Persia and Mesopotamia, sacking ancient cities like Baghdad and Damascus with pitiless ferocity. Those who resisted were massacred in their thousands, the severed heads of Timur's enemies stacked in grisly towers as monuments to his victories. Timur's onslaught reached its terrible apex in 1398, when he invaded India and descended upon Delhi, the jewel of the Sultanate. The city's defenders were slaughtered in a day-long frenzy of blood and fire, its streets choked with corpses. Timur's soldiers carried off vast amounts of treasure and over 100,000 captives to be sold as slaves. The conquest of Delhi was a blow from which India would take centuries to recover. But for all his battlefield triumphs, Timur's cruelty was not confined to the ebb and flow of war. He was known to devise horrific tortures for those who defied him, from live burial to dismemberment by sword. Even the loyalty of his own followers was no guarantee of safety. Timur once had a prince who had fought valiantly for him, flayed alive for a perceived slight, then forced the man's own wife to dance at a feast amid the gore of her husband's carcass. By the time of his death in 1405, Timur had carved out an empire that stretched from Russia to the Indian Ocean, from Turkey to the frontiers of China. His campaigns had claimed the lives of an estimated 17 million people, an almost unimaginable toll, even in an age well versed in bloodshed. The splendor of the architectural wonders he left behind, like the soaring Bibi Khanim Mosque in Samarkand, could scarcely offset the ocean of blood that paid for them. Timur's enduring legacy is one of awe and revulsion in equal measure. His military genius and indomitable will brought him world-shaking power, but it was power wielded with a ruthless cruelty that even the war-hardened Khans of the steppe blanched to behold. He was a conqueror in the mold of Genghis Khan and Alexander the Great, but one for whom terror and butchery were the first and most favored tools of statecraft. The life of Timur the Lame reads like something out of humanity's most fevered nightmares. A tale of unrestrained ambition married to an almost superhuman capacity for cruelty on a mass scale. That such a man could rise so high and cast such a long shadow is perhaps the most chilling reminder of the depths to which the human spirit can sink in the pursuit of dominion. In Timur, we see the culmination of an age in which the mightiest could visit unimaginable atrocities on the world and be remembered by posterity as great. As we survey the long and blood-soaked pageant of the Middle Ages, it can be difficult to draw easy lessons or conclusions. The age that gave us soaring cathedrals and chivalric romances was the same one that saw the Crusades and the Black Death, the conquests of Genghis Khan and Timur the Lame. It was a time of astonishing contrasts, of piety and brutality, of high ideals and base cruelty. The figures we have examined, Vlad the Impaler, the fanatical crusaders, King Richard III, Cesare Borgia, and Timur, stand out as some of the most chillingly cruel actors in an era not known for its gentleness. They wielded power with a ruthlessness that shocks us even at a distance of centuries. Their deeds, impaling enemies en masse, burning heretics alive, massacring whole cities, seem to belong more to the realm of dark fantasy than sober history, yet it would be a mistake to dismiss these men as mere monsters, aberrations divorced from their historical context. In many ways, they were products of their time, a time when violence was the rule rather than the exception, when life was often nasty, brutish, and short for commoners and kings alike. The unrestrained brutality of a Vlad Dracula or a Timur was extreme even by the standards of the day, but it existed on a continuum with the casual cruelty that pervaded much of medieval society. At the same time, we should resist the temptation to paint the entire Middle Ages as an unrelenting parade of horrors. Even in the darkest times, there were glimmers of light, acts of kindness, devotion, and self-sacrifice that remind us of the better angels of our nature. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of universities, the flourishing of art and philosophy, and the slow but steady growth of the rule of law. The period was one of complex social and cultural ferment, not simply a black hole of unmitigated cruelty. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the cruelest figures of We've explored some of the most notoriously ruthless individuals to cast long shadows over the medieval world. Figures like Vlad the Impaler, with his forest of impaled victims, or Timur the Lame and his gruesome victory monuments built from severed heads. But the cruelty of the Middle Ages wasn't confined solely to these infamous rulers and warlords. From the Crusades to the Inquisition to widespread peasant repression, entire societies could be swept up in tides of savagery and suffering. The First Crusade, launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, set the tone for 2 centuries of sanctioned bloodshed in the name of religion. When the Crusaders finally breached the walls of Jerusalem in 1099 after a grueling siege, they proceeded to slaughter the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in a horrific massacre. Thousands were put to the sword, their blood said to flow up to the Crusaders' ankles in parts of the city. This brutality shocked even some European chroniclers of the time, a grim foreshadowing of the sectarian violence the Crusades would unleash. Back home, the call to crusade also sparked waves of persecution against Jewish communities across Europe. Mobs of zealous crusaders, fired up by preachers and their own religious fervor, descended on Jewish neighborhoods in France and the Rhineland. Faced with the choice of conversion or death, hundreds of Jews are recorded to have committed suicide rather than renounce their faith. These pogroms were a chilling early example of the anti-Semitism that would rear its head time and again in medieval Europe. Of course, Christians weren't above turning on their own as well. In the early 13th century, the Albigensian Crusade saw a French Catholic army lay waste to the region of Languedoc, determined to stamp out the Cathar heresy that had gained a foothold there. The town of Béziers bore the brunt of the Crusaders' wrath. When asked how to tell the heretics from the faithful among the townspeople, the abbot in charge famously replied, Kill them all, God will know his own. In the ensuing massacre, thousands were put to the sword or burned alive in the church where they sought shelter. Such atrocities were hardly isolated incidents in an age where violence and cruelty were woven into the very fabric of society. Public executions were a popular spectacle, drawing crowds to watch the condemned meet a grisly end. Some methods were especially sadistic, burning at the stake for accused heretics and witches, or the agonizingly slow death of the breaking wheel, where the victim's limbs were smashed with a heavy wooden wheel before being braided into the spokes and left to die of exposure. Even high-ranking nobles weren't safe from such brutality. In England, the gruesome ritual of hanging, drawing and quartering was reserved for those convicted of treason against the crown. Yet as much as the cruelty of the Middle Ages was embodied by powerful individuals, it also simmered in the broader resentments and injustices of society. The 14th century saw a perfect storm of failing harvests, famine and plague plunge the peasantry into deepening poverty and desperation. Pushed to the brink, common folk periodically erupted into open revolt, only to be crushed mercilessly by their well-armed overlords. The French Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 and the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 met brutal ends at the hands of the nobility. In the wake of each failed uprising, the reprisals were vicious, rebels hunted down, summarily executed, their severed heads displayed on pikes as a warning to others. The retribution meted out by England's boy king Richard II against the rebel leader Wat Tyler and his followers was especially uncompromising. Though only 14 years old, Richard coldly oversaw the mass execution of the rebel leaders, setting the tone for an utterly ruthless monarchy. As the Middle Ages wound on through the 15th century, the games of power and conquest played by Europe's rulers reached new heights of viciousness. The Italian peninsula became a chessboard for the schemes of the notorious Borgia family. Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, was the ultimate Machiavellian prince, relentlessly ambitious, utterly ruthless, and not above murdering his own brother to eliminate a rival for power. His brutal campaign to carve out a central Italian kingdom for himself left a trail of massacres and atrocities in his wake. Meanwhile, England was convulsed by decades of dynastic civil war, as the houses of Lancaster and York vied for the crown in the Wars of the Roses. This was a time when even the highest nobility couldn't escape the deadly intrigues and betrayals of the age. The Earl of Warwick, once the most powerful magnate in England, ended up dead in a ditch after leading rebellions against two different kings. And then there was Richard III, forever vilified by Shakespeare and in popular lore for his alleged murder of his young nephews in the Tower of London, a crime that is still debated to this day. Richard's own death at Bosworth Field in 1485, the last English king to fall in battle, brought an end to the Middle Ages in England with one last spasm of violence. And in many ways, his story embodies the larger themes of the medieval era: the fatal allure of power, the sudden reversals of fortune, the deadly rivalries and betrayals, and yes, the profound human capacity for cruelty. It's easy to look back at the Middle Ages and see a world awash in blood and brutality. And while the era certainly had more than its share of villains and tyrants, it's important to remember that it was also a time of grandeur and gallantry, of chivalric ideals and soaring cathedrals. Like any age, it was a complex tapestry, woven of light and shadow. But perhaps more than anything, the cruelty of the Middle Ages is a reminder of the darkest impulses that can lurk within the human heart. In an era where power was so often absolute and unchecked, it's chilling to see just how far some were willing to go in its pursuit. From the murderous ambitions of Cesare Borgia to the terrifying sadism of Vlad the Impaler, these historical figures shock us with the sheer scale and intensity of their brutality. Yet even as we recoil from their crimes, we can also find some threads of familiarity. After all, the cruelest people of the Middle Ages were still people, driven by very human lusts and fears, grudges and greed. To study their stories is to gaze into a dark mirror of our species and to reckon with the stark truth that the capacity for profound cruelty is part of the human condition. In the end, maybe that's the real lesson the Middle Ages holds for us. For all the splendor and achievement of medieval civilization, it was still a world where unchecked power begat unspeakable atrocity. A world where all too often, the better angels of our nature were drowned out by our darkest demons. By peering into this shadowed past, perhaps we can learn something about the present and the need to build a future where such cruelty is less and less possible. It's a journey that's well worth taking, even as we explore the lives and legacies of the cruelest people in medieval history. Because only by confronting the darkest chapters of our shared story can we begin to write brighter ones. And in the end, isn't that what history is all about? Grappling with the complex, often troubling reality of the human experience, not to despair at our flaws and failures, but to learn from them and to keep reaching for a better world. The Middle Ages may have been a time stained by blood and cruelty, but it was also an era shot through with humanity in all its shades and contradictions. And that's what makes it endlessly fascinating to study and explore, even now, centuries later. So, as we come to the end of our journey through the lives of medieval Europe's cruelest figures, let's remember to hold both truths in our minds: the light and the darkness, the good and the evil. Only then can we truly see the Middle Ages for what it was, a pivotal, sometimes painful, always profoundly human chapter in the grand and unfinished story of our species. Let's return now to one of the most infamous figures of the Middle Ages, Vlad III Dracula, better known to history as Vlad the Impaler. Born in 1431 in the Principality of Wallachia, part of modern-day Romania, Vlad was the second son of Vlad the Sun Dracul. His father, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christendom against the Ottoman Turks, would eventually ascend to the Wallachian throne. But Vlad's early life was far from stable or secure. In a political maneuver, his father sent young Vlad and his brother Radu to the court of the Ottoman Sultan Murad II as hostages, essentially collateral to ensure Wallachia's compliance as an Ottoman vassal. It was a tumultuous childhood that undoubtedly shaped Vlad, exposing him to the wrath and brutality of the Ottoman realm. Vlad spent his formative years in this gilded Ottoman cage, absorbing the cruelties and intrigues of the Sultan's court. Some historians argue this experience forged Vlad's own sadistic tendencies, that the traumas endured under his Ottoman captors warped the young prince. Regardless, it instilled in him a lifelong hatred of the Turks and a wrath he would unleash on countless thousands later in life. Released from Ottoman captivity in 1448 after 6 long years, Vlad returned to a Wallachia in turmoil. Rival factions of nobles vied for control. The Hungarians and Ottomans played the principality as a pawn in their broader power struggle, and Vlad's own father had been deposed, blinded, and brutally buried alive by his opponents. It was a baptism in blood and betrayal for the young Vlad. Determined to claim his birthright, Vlad played the shifting tides of power. He courted Hungarian support to challenge for the throne, briefly claiming it in 1448 before being forced into exile. But his resolve never wavered. In 1456, backed by Hungarian forces, Vlad returned to seize the crown once more. This reign would be longer and infinitely more brutal. From the outset, Vlad moved with ruthless precision to consolidate his rule and eliminate rivals. He invited hundreds of noblemen and their families to a great Easter feast at the princely court in Târgoviște. As they dined, Vlad's soldiers surrounded the great hall. None would leave alive. The Impaler Prince, it is said, had them all stabbed to death, impaled on spikes, and their twitching bodies hoisted high around the walls of the capital, a grotesque display to cow any thoughts of defiance among the nobles. Such wanton cruelty and mass executions would come to define Vlad's reign. Soon, the roads and hillsides of Wallachia were a veritable forest of impaled corpses. Tens of thousands met this slow, agonizing death. Ottoman POWs, Saxon merchants, anyone accused of disloyalty, even random villagers conscripted to provide fresh victims when offenders ran low. Vlad's murderous sadism was matched only by his cunning statecraft in the snake pit of Balkan politics. He deftly played Hungary and the Ottomans against each other, stoking their mutual antagonism to preserve a veneer of Wallachian autonomy. He courted the support of the influential Transylvanian Saxons by exempting them from tolls and gifting them commercial privileges. All the while, his impaled enemies rotted outside the city walls. One particularly chilling account recalls how Vlad once dined among this grotesque garden, the air thick with the stench of death and buzzing of flies, as he forced a retinue of Ottoman envoys to join him. One sickened dignitary reportedly fainted from the horror. Vlad, unfazed, coldly ordered him impaled on a higher stake so the flies would not disturb him. Such tales grew into dark legend, striking terror across Central Europe and the Ottoman Empire. In Wallachia, it is said that during Vlad's reign, crime all but vanished. None dared risk the Impaler's wrathful judgment. Across the Danube, Sultan Mehmed II, the feared conqueror of Constantinople, led a punitive invasion in 1462 to unseat this troublesome vassal. Marching into Wallachia, the Ottoman troops encountered a decimated land, villages burned and wells poisoned on Vlad's orders. Rotting corpses littered the roads. Outside the capital, a terrifying sight awaited. A veritable forest of 20,000 impaled Turkish captives. Even Mehmed was shaken. Though Vlad's guerrilla raids could not halt the larger Ottoman army, and he was eventually forced from the throne, his legend only grew. He would return one final time in 1476 to retake the crown, only to die in battle against the Turks that same winter. In the end, Vlad the Impaler had reigned for only about 6 years in all, and yet his monstrous cruelties would be remembered for centuries as the stuff of nightmares. Even in death, dark tales continued to swirl around the Impaler Prince. His severed head was sent to Constantinople, displayed on a spike before the Sultan. His body was allegedly buried at the island monastery of Snagov, and yet, when researchers uncovered the presumed grave in 1931, they found the tomb empty. Thus, Vlad Dracula passed into legend, a figure of spine-chilling savagery and the archetypal Gothic tyrant. When Bram Stoker penned his genre-defining vampire novel Dracula in 1897, he drew directly on stories of the infamous Wallachian ruler. While Stoker's charismatic count and his dramatic Transylvanian castle bore little resemblance to the real Vlad III, the name Dracula would be immortalized as an embodiment of evil and a permanent fixture in our collective nightmares. More than 500 years after his death, the name of Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, still evokes both revulsion and dark fascination. A byword for brutality, yet revered by some as a defender of Christendom, a folk hero who stood against the Ottoman tide. Such is the complex, blood-soaked legacy of this son of the dragon. In the annals of human cruelty, the deeds of Vlad Dracula remain forever carved in crimson, a testament to the horrors we inflict upon one another. But for all Vlad's lasting infamy, he was far from alone in perpetrating such savageries in medieval Europe. The Middle Ages were an era steeped in violence and religious strife, when entire communities would be put to the sword in the name of faith and empire. And nowhere was this unholy wrath more ruthlessly unleashed than in the Crusades. When Pope Urban II ascended a platform in a field outside Clermont, France, on November 27, 1095, his words would echo across centuries and unleash a tide of holy war that would forever scar the medieval world. Addressing the assembled clergy and nobles, Urban called upon the knights of Christendom to cease their petty feuding and take up the cross, to march east and liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule. He promised the assembled throng spiritual rewards for this armed pilgrimage, remission of their sins. At his fiery exhortation, the crowd roared in response, Deus vult, God wills it. Thus began the First Crusade, a monumental military campaign that would see tens of thousands of European knights, foot soldiers, and even peasants march thousands of miles to the Levant. After a grueling slog across Anatolia and the siege of Antioch, the Crusaders finally reached their ultimate goal in June 1099, the walled holy city of Jerusalem. Weakened by thirst and exhausted from the long siege under the baking Syrian sun, the Crusaders finally breached the walls on July 15th. What followed was an unholy slaughter. The streets ran red as the crusading knights and their rabble, whipped into zealous fervor, slaughtered thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Chroniclers boasted that the conquering Christians waded through blood up to their ankles as they hacked down men, women, and children in an orgy of carnage. In the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where thousands of civilians sought refuge, the bloodshed was so terrible that crusaders were said to have ridden their horses through gore up to the bridles. This savagery was celebrated in Europe as a monumental Christian triumph. The crusading lords carved out new Latin kingdoms in the Levant, ruling over an uneasy patchwork of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish subjects. And yet the violence was far from over. As word of the conquest spread, more crusading armies mustered across Europe, seeing a chance at martial glory and spiritual reward in the Holy Land. Not all of these righteous knights looked to the east, however. For some, the threat to Christendom was much closer to home. As the fervour for holy war grew, an uglier undercurrent of persecution swept across Europe, particularly against Jewish communities. Long an oppressed minority, the Jews now found themselves accused of aiding the Muslims, of hoarding wealth needed for the Crusades, even of blood libel, sacrificing Christian children in secret rituals. Inflamed by this hateful propaganda, crusading mobs descended on Jewish quarters across the continent. In the spring of 1096, as the armies of the First Crusade marched towards Constantinople, a wave of pogroms rippled across the Rhineland. In Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, hundreds of Jews were massacred by self-proclaimed crusaders, offered the choice of baptism or the sword. Many chose suicide and martyrdom over forced conversion. In Mainz, the Rabbi Uri ben Yosef exhorted the community to take their own lives rather than abandon their faith, slitting the throats of his own children before killing himself. Such grim scenes would be repeated in later crusades, the Jews becoming a convenient scapegoat for zealous Christian rage. But the threat of persecution could come from within Christendom as well. Even as the Crusaders battled Muslims in the Holy Land, the papacy increasingly turned its sights on stamping out heresy at home. The most infamous of these initiatives was the Albigensian Crusade, launched by Pope Innocent III in 1209 against the Cathar sect of southern France. The Cathars were dualists, believing in a struggle between good and evil, between a benevolent god of the spirit and a malevolent deity that created the corrupt material world. Denounced as heretics by the Catholic Church, the Cathars and their noble protectors in Languedoc were marked for a crusade of fire and blood. For 2 bloody decades, the papal forces waged a brutal campaign of siege and slaughter across Occitania, determined to wipe out the Albigensian heresy. When crusaders stormed the Cathar stronghold of Béziers in July 1209, soldiers asked the papal legate how to distinguish true believers from heretics. His chilling reply, "Kill them all, God will know his own." The city's entire population of 20,000 was put to the sword. Such atrocities played out again and again, at Minerve, at Lavaux, at Montségur, where hundreds of Cathars were burned alive in a great pyre rather than renounce their faith. By the time the crusade ground to a halt in 1229, Catharism had been virtually exterminated. Languedoc lay in ruins, and the Inquisition had risen as a permanent institution to police orthodoxy. The fires lit in Occitania would later blaze across Spain, across Europe in a relentless war on heresy. Religious violence was thus a grim constant of the crusading era, a holy mandate used to justify unspeakable atrocities. In the name of faith, entire communities were put to the sword, tortured, and burned. Such horrors stand as a haunting reminder of the human capacity for cruelty when gripped by destructive ideologies, even in the name of the divine. The Crusades left a bitter legacy that would scar relations between Christianity and Islam for centuries. A cycle of retaliatory brutality, massacres, and persecution that perpetuated an us versus them mentality, seeing those of different faiths as enemies to be destroyed rather than human beings. The lofty ideals of chivalry, of holy warriors defending the meek, all too often rang hollow before the blood-curdling screams of the innocent. This, sadly, was the crusading movement's most enduring impact, a chapter of profound tragedy in the human story, when those marching under the banner of the cross committed some of the cruelest deeds in medieval history. In seeking to forge a path to heaven, the Crusaders often unleashed hell on earth for people of all faiths. But as we continue our journey through the Middle Ages, we'll see that holy warriors were far from alone in their capacity for brutality. In a world where might made right, those who held power could inflict horrific tortures on their enemies and subjects with impunity. The shrieks of the damned echoed from castle dungeons and public squares across medieval Europe, as terror became both a tool of control and a gruesome spectacle. So settle in, if you can, as we venture into the darkest depths of human cruelty, a world of twisted iron and shattered bone, of blood, flames, and agonized screams before baying crowds, the horrific pageantry of medieval torture and execution. But beware, here there is no merciful release, no easy escape into restful oblivion, only a nightmare procession of the broken and the dead, a parade of the past's most ghastly horrors to trouble our weary minds. Let us descend then, together, into this pitiless purgatory. Torture in the Middle Ages was not merely a means of extracting information or confessions, though it certainly served that ruthless purpose as well. More than that, it was a tool of raw terror, a way for the powerful to break and subjugate the powerless through the most visceral of means. The flesh became both a canvas for cruelty and a medium for sending messages, that the sovereign and the state held the ultimate power over the bodies of their subjects. And in an age of absolute monarchs and feudal lords, such grim messages were a regular part of the medieval world. Torture was enshrined in law, from the dungeons of the Inquisition to the brutalities of common criminal justice. The very word torture derives from the Latin torcere, to twist, to distort, an all too apt description of what befell the accused. Among the most infamous devices was the rack, a contraption designed to systematically dislocate the victim's joints through agonizing stretching. By cranking the levers and ropes, the torturer could ratchet up the pain, shattering shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees with sickening pops even before the inevitable dismemberment. Few could endure the rack without eventually spilling whatever secrets their interrogators wanted to hear. But for those accused of witchcraft or communion with the devil, even the brutal efficiency of the rack was deemed insufficient. In these cases, Fire was the preferred means of prying out confessions. Red-hot pincers tore at bare skin. Boiling water, molten lead, even burning sulfur were poured over the naked flesh. Iron brands seared the sign of the cross into trembling limbs, the ultimate seal of guilt. And if the accused refused to submit, to confess to whatever heresy or curse they were charged with, then the trial by ordeal awaited, a perverse appeal to divine judgment. The suspect's hands would be bound and weighted with stones before being tossed into a pool or river. If they sank, they were innocent, a righteous soul embraced by holy waters. But if they floated, they were surely in league with the devil, rejected by God's grace. A convenient paradox that ensured the torturers could have their way regardless. For those rare souls who emerged unscathed, acquitted of their supposed crimes, the spectre of torture still loomed. The mere experience often left them broken shells, physically and mentally shattered, haunted forever by their time in the torturer's embrace. And yet, in the cruel calculus of the age, this mattered little. What was one commoner's sanity against the social order? The chance to make an example. Indeed, torture was but a preview, a taster of the grim fate that awaited so many of the condemned. In a world without mass media, where the sovereign's power was made manifest through visceral displays, execution was a public spectacle, a gruesome festival of state power and mob bloodlust. Looming above it all was the executioner, a figure both reviled and revered in medieval society. An outcast by dint of his macabre trade, but also a necessary agent of justice, a grim celebrity who could make the hardened criminal and the enthralled spectator tremble with a single stroke of his blade. And that blade was often but the final mercy after a hideous litany of tortures. The execution of a traitor or heretic was not simply a quick drop and a sudden stop, but a prolonged ritual of mutilation. In England, the dreaded sentence of being hanged, drawn, and quartered saw the victim cut down while still alive, only to have their entrails torn out and burned before their eyes as they watched, screaming. Their body would then be hacked into quarters. The Middle Ages were a time of soaring cathedrals and chivalrous knights, of pious crusaders and holy pilgrimages. But beneath this veneer of virtue, cruelty often reigned supreme. From the halls of power to blood-soaked battlefields, some figures plumbed the depths of human brutality, earning their place among the cruelest people in medieval history. Perhaps no individual embodies this savagery quite like Vlad the Impaler. Born in 1431 in Wallachia, a principality in present-day Romania, Vlad Dracula, as he was also known, unleashed a reign of terror that still chills the blood to this day. The second son of Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Impaler, seemed fated for a life of violence from an early age. As a youth, he and his younger brother were seized as hostages by the Ottoman Sultan and held captive for years. This bitter experience left Vlad with a seething hatred for the Turks, one he would express in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Ascending to the throne of Wallachia in 1456, Vlad soon revealed his taste for brutality. He earned his grim moniker, the Impaler, for his favoured method of execution, a slow, agonizing death that involved driving stakes through the bodies of his victims. The townsfolk of Wallachia whispered fearfully of forests of the impaled, where thousands suffered this ghastly fate. It was a savagery exceeded only by the delight Vlad seemed to take in it. One story holds that he even dined among the impaled, dipping his bread in their blood. But impalement was only one shade in Vlad's palette of cruelty. His twisted imagination conjured up all manner of sadistic tortures. He was known to nail turbans to the heads of Turkish envoys, or even force captives to eat the flesh of their compatriots. On one occasion, he rounded up the elderly, sick, and poor of his land and had them burned alive, considering them a burden. Vlad's monstrous acts, were a form of psychological warfare, a way to terrify his enemies into submission. And in this, he surely succeeded. The Ottoman armies turned back rather than face the Impaler prince. For all his cruelty, there were those in Wallachia who saw Vlad as a hero, a defender of Christendom against the Ottoman threat. But even his most ardent admirers could not deny the depths of his viciousness. It's perhaps fitting that Vlad's bloody deeds would later partly inspire the legend of Dracula, a figure synonymous with terror. Though Vlad himself fell in battle against the Ottomans around 1477, his dark shadow would loom over history, a testament to the evil that can fester in the hearts of men. But Vlad was far from alone in his capacity for cruelty. The age of the Crusades, which repeatedly pitted European Christendom against the Muslim powers of the Middle East, bore witness to atrocities on an immense scale. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095, he urged the Knights of Europe to take up the cross and reclaim the Holy Land in the name of God. What followed was a tide of fanatical violence that would leave an indelible stain on medieval history. In 1099, the Crusaders laid siege to Jerusalem, the most sacred city in Christendom. After weeks of desperate fighting, they finally breached the walls and unleashed a horrific slaughter. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city were put to the sword en masse, without regard for age or sex. Blood ran ankle-deep through the streets, and piles of severed heads and limbs towered above the carnage. One contemporary account even describes crusaders wading through gore up to their knees to reach the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they offered tearful prayers of thanksgiving. This savagery set the tone for crusades to come. Whenever Christian armies clashed with Muslim foes, brutality was the order of the day. After the fall of the Crusader state of Edessa in 1144, enraged European mobs blamed the Jews, seen as infidels in league with the Muslims. A wave of pogroms swept through the Rhineland, leaving hundreds of Jewish men, women, and children dead in a chilling foreshadowing of horrors to come centuries later. But the violence of the Crusades did not only fall on those outside Christendom. In the early 1200s, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France deemed heretical. The Albigensian Crusade, as it was known, scoured the region with fire and sword. Besieged by crusaders, the city of Béziers refused to hand over its Cathar inhabitants. In reply, the papal legate directing the assault supposedly declared, "Kill them all. God will know his own." When the city fell, some 15,000 to 20,000 men, women and children were slaughtered indiscriminately. Such atrocities were fueled by religious fervour, but also by the medieval penchant for spectacular violence. In an age before mass media, the gruesome public spectacle of torture and execution served as both a warning and a twisted form of entertainment. The Church, in particular, made a show of rooting out heresy and witchcraft. Those convicted would meet the flames at the stake, writhing in torment as the wood beneath them crackled and hissed. For those not accused of offences against God, there were other creative means of destruction. The breaking wheel, a device that slowly shattered the limbs of victims tied to its spokes, was widely feared. In England, the most notorious traitors suffered the grim fate of being hanged, drawn, and quartered, a sequence of strangulation, disembowelment, beheading, and dismemberment that left bodies in pieces for public display. The agony of such punishments is beyond modern comprehension. Among the English monarchs who resorted to such measures was King John, the villainous Plantagenet ruler who reigned from 1199 to 1216. A spiteful, petty tyrant despised by his own barons, John plunged England into civil war and chaos. After losing Normandy and his other French lands to rival Capetian kings, John lashed out with increasing cruelty toward his own subjects. When a group of rebellious nobles forced John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, granting them rights and limiting royal power, the enraged king quickly disavowed the charter and plunged England back into conflict. John rampaged across the countryside with an army of mercenaries, unleashing a campaign of violence to bring his enemies to heel. Those barons captured in the fighting faced immediate execution, their severed heads sent as a warning to others. John's vicious conduct earned him few friends, but the mysterious fate of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, sealed his sinister reputation. As the son of John's elder brother, Arthur had a strong claim to the English throne. When he disappeared in John's custody in 1203, many suspected the king's hand in the young prince's demise. Though the truth remains murky, the taint of kinslaying only added to John's aura of malevolence. The cruelty of kings like John often fell hardest on the lowly peasants, who eked out a meagre living under the boot of the nobility. In the 14th century, as the Black Death scythed through Europe, and crop failures led to widespread famine, the common folk faced unimaginable hardship. Pushed to the brink, some finally rose up in desperate revolt against their masters. In France, the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 saw peasants lash out against the nobles who had oppressed them for so long. Roving bands attacked manor houses, looting and burning, even murdering those aristocrats they could get their hands on. But the lords of France soon rallied and crushed the uprising with pitiless force. The retribution was brutal. Peasant villages put to the torch, their inhabitants massacred without mercy. England faced its own reckoning in 1381, when simmering resentments over heavy taxation and labour laws boiled over into the peasants' revolt. Under the leadership of Wat Tyler, a motley army of commoners, artisans, and renegade priests marched on London, attacking government buildings and beheading some of those deemed responsible for their plight. The young King Richard II met with Tyler and the rebels, agreeing to their demands, but only as a ruse. Once the rebel force dispersed, Richard unleashed a ferocious crackdown. Hundreds were executed, their severed heads lining London Bridge as a grisly warning against further insurrection. The vicious repression of such uprisings underscored the cruelty inherent in medieval society, a world where the strong ruled with an iron fist and the weak could only suffer in silence. But even by the standards of this unforgiving age, some figures stood out for their sheer ruthlessness. One such man was Timur, known to history as Tamerlane. A Turkic-Mongol warlord in the mold of Genghis Khan, Timur rose from obscurity in 14th century Central Asia to become one of the most feared conquerors in history. He built his empire on mountains of skulls, leaving a trail of devastation across Eurasia. In 1401, he sacked Damascus, ordering a massacre so thorough that the streets were choked with corpses. But this was only a prelude to the horrors he would unleash on Baghdad. When Timur's armies stormed the great Abbasid capital in 1401, they slaughtered tens of thousands, a blow from which the city would never recover. The conqueror took a special delight in erecting towers of severed heads as monuments to his victories, a sight that would greet him as his armies marched through the ruined lands he claimed as his own. Timur's conquests reached as far as India, where he invaded the Delhi Sultanate in 1398. The Turkic-Afghan rulers of the Sultanate were Muslim, like Timur himself, but that did not spare them from his wrath. Thousands were slain or enslaved as the conqueror's armies rampaged across the subcontinent, plundering its riches and leaving devastation in their wake. For all the terror he inspired, Timur was hardly the last cruel conqueror to leave his mark on medieval history. In Europe, the Wars of the Roses saw England convulsed by decades of dynastic conflict in the late 15th century. This bloody civil war between the rival houses of York and Lancaster featured a cavalcade of ruthless nobles vying for power, their ambitions drenched in the blood of friend and foe alike. One of the most notorious figures of the conflict was Richard III, the last Yorkist king. Though his villainy may have been exaggerated by later Tudor propagandists, Richard's rise to power was undeniably soaked in gore. He stands accused of ordering the murder of his own nephews, the famed princes in the Tower, to secure his grip on the throne. Whether guilty of this deed or not, Richard was certainly responsible for the brutal execution of a number of rivals, their heads impaled on spikes for all to see. Richard's reign would be cut short by the rise of Henry Tudor, who defeated and slew the king at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. The carnage of that day brought an end to the Wars of the Roses, but it was a peace born of exhaustion rather than any higher ideal. The cruelty of the age had simply burned itself out, leaving a kingdom in ashes. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, one last figure would embody the ruthless spirit of the era. Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, was a true Renaissance man, a skilled warrior, a cunning diplomat, and an utterly amoral schemer. As a cardinal in the Catholic Church, Cesare seemed destined for a life of piety, but his ambitions would lead him down a far darker path. Determined to carve out a kingdom for himself in the patchwork of city-states and principalities that made up Italy, Cesare embarked on a campaign of conquest and betrayal. He thought nothing of dispatching those who stood in his way, even his own brother, Juan, whom he likely had murdered in 1497. The crime shocked all of Europe, but Cesare hardly blinked an eye. For him, fratricide was simply another move in the great game of power. As Cesare rampaged across central Italy, his reputation for cruelty grew. He was said to delight in the suffering of his enemies, devising new and inventive tortures to break their will. One contemporary described him as a man of a very cruel nature who took pleasure in watching people die. It was a description that could have applied to any number of medieval tyrants, but Cesare's cold, calculating brand of ruthlessness set him apart. For all his viciousness, Cesare's methods were undeniably effective. He succeeded in bringing much of central Italy under his sway, ruling with an iron fist. His example would later inspire Niccolò Machiavelli, who saw in Cesare the model of a truly effective ruler, one who let nothing stand in the way of his ambitions. It was a chilling endorsement of the cruelty that had defined so much of the medieval world. As we look back on the Middle Ages from the distance of centuries, it can be easy to romanticize the era, to imagine a world of chivalrous knights and pious crusaders, of soaring cathedrals and holy relics. But the truth is far more complex and far more disturbing. For every act of nobility or devotion, there were countless others of brutality and savagery. The cruelest figures of the Middle Ages, men like Vlad the Impaler, King John, Timur, and Cesare Borgia, stand as dark reminders of the evil that can lurk in the human heart. Their deeds shock and horrify us, even at a distance of centuries, but they were hardly anomalies in their own time. The medieval world was one steeped in violence, where life was often nasty, brutish, and short. Yet even in this grim tapestry, there were glimmers of light. For every cruel tyrant, there were those who resisted their depredations, brave souls who fought for justice, however imperfectly. And in the soaring art and architecture of the age, in the piety of the faithful and the courage of the downtrodden, we can glimpse the better angels of our nature struggling to assert themselves. In the end, perhaps the true lesson of the Middle Ages is that cruelty is not an aberration. It is a constant temptation, one that must be guarded against in every age. The worst excesses of the era may seem remote to us now, lost in the mists of time. But the capacity for brutality lies within us all, waiting only for the right circumstances to be unleashed. As we reflect on the cruelest people in medieval history, let us do so with a sense of humility and a determination to learn from the dark chapters of our past. For only by confronting the shadows can we hope to build a world where cruelty is the exception rather than the rule. As we've seen, the Middle Ages were a time of contrasts, soaring cathedrals and chivalric ideals on one hand, shocking brutality and cruelty on the other. Perhaps no figure embodies this dark side of the medieval psyche more than Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, a man whose thirst for blood was so great that he earned the moniker Vlad the Impaler. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, in modern-day Romania, Vlad was the second son of Vlad II Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia. The young Vlad's early life was marked by upheaval and struggle. As a child, he and his younger brother Radu were seized by the Ottoman Sultan as hostages to ensure their father's loyalty. It was a formative experience that surely shaped Vlad's psyche and his later penchant for cruelty. Upon the death of his father and older brother, Vlad claimed the Wallachian throne in 1448. But his first reign was short-lived. Within months, he was forced into exile by rival factions backed by Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Undeterred, Vlad bided his time, building alliances and waiting for his moment to strike back and reclaim his birthright. That moment came in 1456. With the support of Hungary and the Christian kingdoms, Vlad returned to Wallachia in triumph, decisively defeating his enemies and taking back the throne. It was the beginning of a reign of terror that would make Vlad Dracula a byword for brutality. As prince, Vlad proved to be an able ruler in some regards, strengthening the Wallachian state, keeping the Ottoman threat at bay, and promoting commerce and stability for his people. But these accomplishments were overshadowed by his legendary sadism and thirst for blood. Vlad's favoured method of execution was, of course, impalement. He would have a wooden stake hammered into the ground, its end sharpened to a brutal point. Victims, sometimes entire towns full of people, would then be forcibly lowered onto the stake, gravity slowly drawing them down as the wooden point pierced their bodies, emerging from their mouths or shoulders in a slow, excruciating death that could take hours or even days. Contemporary chronicles speak of forests of the impaled, thousands of men, women and children writhing and moaning on the stakes, a visceral warning to any who would cross the Prince of Wallachia. One Ottoman account describes how Vlad dined among his victims, dipping his bread in their blood. Whether such accounts are exaggerated is hard to say, but there's no doubt that Vlad's cruelty was extreme even by the harsh standards of the time. He had disloyal subjects, some say over 30,000, tortured and executed, often disemboweling and decapitating them. The scale of the carnage shocked even Vlad's allies. But brutality was also a calculated tactic for Vlad. He used terror and psychological warfare to cement his power and intimidate his enemies, especially the Ottomans. Facing Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, Vlad knew he was outmatched militarily. But through sheer ruthlessness, he made himself too costly to dislodge. The most famous example came in 1462, when Mehmed himself invaded Wallachia with a large army. Vlad harried the Ottomans mercilessly, poisoning wells, burning villages, luring the enemy into traps. Then, in a shocking display, he impaled over 20,000 captives on stakes in a field outside the capital, creating a horrific forest of the dead that stopped the Sultan's advance in its tracks. In the end, though, even such unimaginable brutality couldn't save Vlad. His alliances crumbled, his own people turned against him, and he was eventually imprisoned by the Hungarians, dying in obscurity sometime around 1477. But his legend only grew after his death. In the coming centuries, tales of Vlad's cruelty spread throughout Europe, cementing his macabre reputation. His patronymic name, Dracula, became synonymous with blood-drinking monsters. He was a source of gruesome fascination, his deeds almost too horrific to believe. When Bram Stoker penned his famous vampire novel in 1897, he drew directly on the Transylvanian tyrant for inspiration. Today, Vlad Dracula endures as a cultural icon, portrayed in countless films, novels, and TV shows. But behind the fictional vampire lies the true story of a medieval ruler consumed by cruelty, a man for whom impalement and torture were matters of state policy, for whom the ends always justified the bloody means. In a savage time, Vlad III stood out as one of history's most sadistic figures, a testament to the dark impulses that lurked within the medieval mind. Of course, Vlad was hardly alone in his capacity for cruelty. The Middle Ages were a time when brutality was often celebrated, especially in matters of religion and holy war. Perhaps no event embodied this more than the Crusades, a series of military campaigns launched by the Catholic Church to retake the Holy Land from Islamic rule. The First Crusade was called by Pope Urban II in 1095, with the stated goal of liberating Jerusalem and the holy places of Palestine from Muslim control. Urban's fiery preaching, combined with the promise of spiritual rewards for crusaders, unleashed a wave of religious fervor across Europe. Nobles and commoners alike took the cross, sewing the emblem onto their clothes as a sign of their sacred mission. But for all its lofty ideals, the First Crusade quickly descended into appalling violence and brutality. After a long and arduous journey across Europe and the Middle East, the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in 1099. They laid siege to the city, constructing towers and catapults to batter the walls, while facing determined resistance from the Muslim defenders. When the city finally fell, the Crusaders poured in, unleashing a horrific slaughter on the population. Men, women, and children were put to the sword, their blood running through the streets. Contemporary chronicles speak of the Crusaders wading through gore up to their ankles, butchering anyone they could find. In the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where thousands of civilians had taken refuge, the knights slaughtered them mercilessly, their screams echoing off the sacred walls. No one was spared, not the elderly, not the infirm, not even babes in arms. It was a scene of unimaginable carnage, driven by religious zeal and the long-simmering hatred between Christians and Muslims. Some accounts even describe the Crusaders pausing in their bloody work to kneel in prayer, giving thanks to God for their victory, before resuming the massacre with renewed fervor. The sack of Jerusalem set the tone for the rest of the crusading movement, while the Crusader states established in the aftermath of that first victory achieved a tenuous coexistence with their Muslim neighbours. The religious wars continued to be marked by acts of shocking brutality on both sides. Later crusades, like the one against the Cathars in southern France or the notorious Fourth Crusade that sacked Christian Constantinople, saw similar atrocities committed in the name of faith. Jews, too, were frequent targets of Crusader violence, with many communities suffering pogroms and massacres as the armies marched east. For all the talk of chivalry and honour, the Crusades revealed the depths of cruelty and fanaticism that could be unleashed in a time of religious fervour. The idea of holy war, of violence sanctioned by God, would have profound and bloody consequences resonating down through the centuries. And while the Crusader ideal inspired great acts of heroism and self-sacrifice, it also gave rise to some of the most brutal chapters in medieval history. Of course, not all medieval cruelty was motivated by religious zeal. Sometimes, it was the simple exercise of power by ruthless individuals, the casual brutality of those who wielded absolute authority over their subjects. The story of King John of England is a prime example. John was the youngest son of King Henry II, a powerful and dynamic ruler who had built a vast empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But while Henry was a skilled politician and military leader, his sons were a fractious and treacherous lot, constantly plotting against their father and each other. John, in particular, had a reputation for pettiness and spite. He was known as Lackland for his habit of betraying his allies and losing the territories entrusted to him. When he finally came to the throne in 1199, after the death of his brother Richard the Lionheart, he quickly proved himself to be a disastrous ruler. John's reign was marked by a series of political and military blunders that cost him the loyalty of his barons and the respect of his subjects. He lost the Duchy of Normandy to the French king, a humiliating defeat that shocked the English aristocracy. He feuded with the church, earning a papal excommunication and an interdict that closed the country's churches. He imposed crippling taxes and arbitrary fines, using the money to fund his own lavish lifestyle and disastrous foreign wars. But it was John's cruelty and capriciousness that truly set him apart. He was known for his violent temper and his habit of lashing out at anyone who crossed him. He once had a papal envoy seized and imprisoned, starving the man until he agreed to pay a huge ransom. He forced a Jewish merchant to have a tooth pulled each day until he handed over a sum of money. He had one of his own barons thrown into a dungeon and starved to death. Perhaps the most notorious story about John concerns his treatment of his own nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur had a strong claim to the English throne, and many of John's barons supported him as a rival. In 1203, John captured Arthur and imprisoned him in the castle of Rouen. What happened next is shrouded in mystery, but the most common account is that John had his young nephew murdered, either by his own hand or on his orders. The death of Arthur was a shocking crime, even by the standards of the time. It cemented John's reputation as a tyrant and a monster, a man who would stop at nothing to hold on to power. It also fueled the growing rebellion against his rule, as more and more barons defected to the French king or rose up in open revolt. In the end, John's cruelty and misrule caught up with him. In 1215, a group of rebel barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that placed limits on royal power and established the principle of the rule of law. It was a watershed moment in English history, a crucial step on the long road to constitutional monarchy and democratic government. But John himself never accepted the Magna Carta. He spent the last year of his life trying to overturn it, waging a brutal civil war against his own subjects. He died in 1216, sick and alone, abandoned by his allies and despised by his people. His cruelty had cost him everything. The story of King John is a reminder that even in a time of great brutality, there were limits to what people would tolerate. His reign was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, of a ruler who governed by whim and cruelty rather than justice and law. And while John's misrule may have been extreme, it was hardly unique in the annals of medieval history. Indeed, the Middle Ages were full of rulers and warlords who wielded power with a brutal hand, who saw their subjects as mere pawns to be used and discarded at will. From the crusading kings of Europe to the Khans of the Mongolian steppes, the period was marked by figures who left a trail of blood and suffering in their wake. One such figure was Timur, known to history as Tamerlane, a Turco-Mongol conqueror who rose to power in the late 14th century. Timur carved out a vast empire stretching from Persia to Russia, from India to Anatolia. He was a military genius, a brilliant strategist and tactician who could marshal huge armies and lead them to victory against seemingly impossible odds. But Timur was also a man of unparalleled brutality, who saw terror and massacre as legitimate tools of statecraft. He would often give conquered cities a choice: surrender immediately or face total annihilation. Those who resisted were subjected to horrific punishments, their populations slaughtered, their leaders buried alive or trampled beneath the hooves of Timur's war horses. In 1398, Timur invaded India, smashing through the defenses of the Delhi Sultanate and sacking the capital city. Contemporary accounts describe the streets running with blood, the piles of severed heads stacked outside the city gates. Timur ordered the massacre of tens of thousands of prisoners, their skulls built into grisly towers as a warning to those who would defy him. Similar atrocities marked Timur's campaigns in the Middle East and Central Asia. He sacked Baghdad in 1401, destroying the city's famous libraries and massacring much of its population. He unleashed his armies on Damascus and Aleppo, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. Even fellow Muslims were not spared his wrath, as he sought to crush any rival power that might challenge his own. Timur's cruelty was so great that it became the stuff of legend, inspiring fear and revulsion across the Eurasian landmass. He was seen as a scourge, a punishment sent by God to chasten the wicked. His name became synonymous with death and destruction, a byword for the horrors of war. And yet, in his own way, Timur was also a product of his time, a warlord who rose to power in an age of chaos and conflict, who used violence and terror to forge an empire out of the fractured remnants of the Mongol hordes. His story is a reminder of the sheer scale of the brutality that was possible in the medieval world, of the depths of cruelty that human beings could sink to in the pursuit of power and glory. Of course, not all medieval cruelty was the work of great conquerors and kings. Sometimes it emerged from the social and economic pressures of the age, the desperate struggles of ordinary people pushed to the brink by hardship and injustice. The story of the peasants' revolts that swept across Europe in the 14th century is a case in point. The 14th century was a time of profound crisis for the medieval world. A series of failed harvests and natural disasters, combined with the devastation of the Black Death, had left much of Europe in a state of economic and social collapse. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, were particularly hard hit, struggling to survive in the face of rising prices, falling wages, and increasing exploitation by their lords. In this context, it's hardly surprising that peasant revolts began to break out across the continent. In France, the Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 saw peasants and townsfolk rise up against the nobility, burning castles and manors, and slaughtering any aristocrat they could get their hands on. The revolt was eventually crushed by the royal army, but not before thousands had been killed on both sides. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was even more dramatic. Sparked by a hated poll tax and years of simmering discontent, the revolt saw tens of thousands of peasants march on London, led by the charismatic rebel Wat Tyler. The rebels stormed the Tower of London, executed the Archbishop of Canterbury, and presented their demands to the young King Richard II. For a moment, it seemed as if the social order of medieval England might be overturned, but the king's promises of reform proved hollow, and when Tyler was killed in a confrontation with the royal officials, the revolt began to fizzle out. In the end, the rebels were brutally suppressed, with thousands hanged or imprisoned in the aftermath. The story of the peasants' revolts is a reminder of the profound inequalities and injustices that marked medieval society. For all the talk of chivalry and honor, the reality for most people was a life of backbreaking labor, constant insecurity, and the ever-present threat of violence and exploitation. When pushed to the limit, even the lowliest peasant could rise up and strike a blow against their oppressors. But the revolts also reveal the savage cruelty with which the medieval elite were willing to defend their privileges. The nobles and knights who crushed the rebels did so with a brutality that shocked even some of their contemporaries. They saw the peasants as little more than beasts to be slaughtered or enslaved at will. The idea that the common people might have rights or grievances of their own was utterly alien to them. In the end, the peasants' revolts were a symptom of a social order that was fundamentally unstable and unjust. They were a cry of rage and desperation from a people who had been pushed to the brink, who saw no other way to assert their humanity in the face of a system that treated them as disposable. And while the revolts themselves were ultimately unsuccessful, They left a legacy of resistance and defiance that would echo down through the centuries. The same could be said of many of the figures and events we've discussed in this program. From Vlad the Impaler to Timur the Lame, from the Crusades to the Wars of the Roses, the Middle Ages were a time of astonishing cruelty and brutality, but they were also a time of great courage and resilience, of ordinary people struggling to assert their dignity and humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. One of the last great figures of the medieval world, and one of its most notorious, was Cesare Borgia. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare was a cardinal and a military leader, a man. The Crusades, a series of religious wars waged by European Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule, exemplify the capacity for cruelty in the medieval era. When Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade in 1095, he sanctioned appalling violence in the name of faith. Casting the Muslims as evil occupiers oppressing Christians, Urban promised spiritual rewards for those who took up the cross to fight. Tens of thousands responded to his call, embarking on a bloody campaign across the Mediterranean. The climax came in 1099 with the siege of Jerusalem. After breaking through the city walls, the Crusaders unleashed a horrific slaughter upon the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Eyewitness accounts speak of streets running red with blood as soldiers and civilians alike were put to the sword. No mercy was shown to women or children. In their religious fervor, the Crusaders saw this as an act of righteous cleansing to purify the holy city. But to the defenders, it was an unspeakable atrocity and searing humiliation. News of Jerusalem's fall sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. The Crusaders established their own kingdoms in the Levant, but these remained under constant threat. Subsequent crusades aimed to shore up these precarious territories, but met with dwindling success. The religious passions unleashed proved impossible to control. Back in Europe, the crusading spirit fueled persecution of Jews, long viewed with suspicion as outsiders. Mobs attacked Jewish communities, giving them the stark choice of conversion or death. Even fellow Christians could find themselves in the crosshairs of crusading armies. In the early 13th century, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade against the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France deemed heretical. The resulting Albigensian crusade saw the Catholic North relentlessly attack the tolerant South, leaving a trail of massacres and destroyed cities. When the besieged Cathars of Béziers refused to hand over their heretics, a papal legate supposedly declared, "Kill them all, God will know his own." The entire population was slaughtered, over 10,000 men, women, and children. The Albigensian Crusade highlights how readily medieval rulers and clergy could employ murderous brutality against even their co-religionists. Dissent was not tolerated. Heresy and rebellion needed to be crushed decisively. The machinery of state violence found its ultimate expression in torture and public execution. For those who ran afoul of the authorities, a grim fate awaited. Torture was widely used to extract confessions and punish criminals. The rack, a wooden frame that stretched the victim's limbs to the breaking point, was a favorite implement. So too was waterboarding, a torment that simulated drowning. But perhaps the most feared was the strappado. The accused would be suspended by the wrists with arms tied behind the back. The unnatural position caused excruciating pain, often dislocating shoulders within minutes. Torturers would add weights to the legs to intensify the agony. Public execution was a common spectacle in medieval times, a stern warning of the wages of sin. Crowds would gather to watch the condemned meet a variety of gruesome ends. Burning at the stake was the sentence for unrepentant heretics or accused witches. The victim would be tied to a wooden post amid a pyre of wood and set ablaze to suffer an unimaginably painful death. A skilled executioner aimed for a slower burn to prolong the ordeal for the baying mob. Another method was known as breaking on the wheel. The condemned would be tied to a large cartwheel, limbs splayed. The executioner would use an iron bar to systematically smash the legs, arms, shoulders, and chest, shattering bone after bone. Finally, a lethal blow to the head or heart delivered the coup de grace. In a final indignity, the mangled body would be woven through the spokes of the wheel and mounted on a tall pole, left to rot as a grim warning. In England, the ultimate punishment for treason was the protracted horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The traitor would first be dragged to the gallows, often over rough ground by a horse, as jeering spectators pelted them with refuse. At the execution site, they would be hanged by the neck, cut down while still alive, and publicly castrated. The stomach would then be slit open and the intestines yanked out and burned before the victim's eyes. Finally, the condemned would be beheaded and the body chopped into 4 quarters for display around the kingdom. It was a slow, humiliating, and agonizing end, calculated to deter any who dared threaten the crown. Such was the fate of Hugh Despencer the Younger, chief advisor to King Edward II. He made a deadly enemy in Queen Isabella, denied the political influence she craved. When Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, seized power and forced Edward to abdicate, they targeted Despencer for his loyalty to the king. Despencer suffered the full traitor's death described above. A ruthless nobleman himself, in his last ghastly moments he reaped the whirlwind of the pitiless times he inhabited. Perhaps no English king has gone down in history as more villainous than John, the youngest son of Henry II. Though he showed military prowess in his youth, John proved a disastrous ruler after inheriting the throne in 1199. Through ineptitude and treachery, he lost the crown's ancestral lands in Normandy to the French king. This humiliation, coupled with punishing taxation, alienated his feudal barons and plunged England into civil war. John had already gained a reputation for petty cruelty prior to becoming king. In a fit of rage, he reportedly murdered his own nephew and rival, Arthur of Brittany, who disappeared suspiciously in 1203. As king, John revelled in the violent suppression of any who challenged his rule. After defeating a rebellion by his barons, he made a vicious example of its leader, William de Mowbray. John had him dragged behind a horse to Coventry, where he was hanged from a gibbet until nearly dead, then disemboweled and beheaded. John's misrule ultimately led to his barons forcing him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, placing limits on royal power. But the king had no intention of abiding by this Charter of Rights. He lashed out with a campaign of destruction across the country, burning barns and seizing crops to starve out his enemies. The barons responded by inviting Prince Louis of France to take the English throne, sparking a fresh civil war. John's reputation as a tyrant was sealed by his death from dysentery. Amid this chaos in 1216, an ignominious end to a cruel and calamitous reign. The 14th century saw some of the worst calamities to ever befall the common folk of Europe. The century opened with the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, the result of a catastrophic perfect storm of colder temperatures, incessant rain that ruined harvests, and rampant crop disease. With reserves exhausted and no relief in sight, desperate peasants resorted to eating dogs, horses, and even human flesh. Millions succumbed to the prolonged effects of malnutrition. A generation later, the Black Death scythed through the population already weakened by food scarcity. The terrifying disease could kill within days, leaving towns and villages desolated. The sheer scale of mortality collapsed the medieval social order. Some lords tried to force the decimated peasantry to keep working as normal, showing little compassion for their plight. Fields went untended, bringing the threat of renewed famine. In this landscape of deprivation and death, eruptions of peasant rage were perhaps inevitable. The Jacquerie Revolt blazed through northern France in 1358, a response to the devastation wrought by the 100 Years' War. Peasant mobs targeted noble estates, burning and pillaging, but reprisals were swift and merciless. The peasants were crushed by the heavily armed nobility and their leaders executed in droves. England faced its own reckoning in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt. An unpopular poll tax, levied 3 times in 4 years, proved the final spark. But long-simmering resentments over restrictive labour laws and the yoke of serfdom supplied the fuel. Rebels led by Wat Tyler marched on London, storming the Tower and executing the Archbishop of Canterbury and Royal Treasurer. Confronting the 14-year-old King Richard II, Tyler outlined the rebels' demands, which included an end to serfdom. Richard appeared to agree, but in a heated exchange, the Lord Mayor of London attacked Tyler, who was stabbed by the king's men. The murder of Tyler decapitated the rebel cause. Richard mobilized a force of over 7,000 soldiers to restore order in the capital. A crackdown in the counties followed, as the king discarded his conciliatory posture. Some 1,500 rebels were executed in a wave of vengeful retribution. Though short-lived, the revolt left an indelible mark. It demonstrated that even the lowliest in society could rise up and shake the foundations of power, however briefly. But it also showed the ruthlessness with which the ruling class would protect its privilege. The Turco-Mongol warlord Timur, known to history as Tamerlane, blazed a trail of unimaginable destruction across Central Asia in the late 14th century. A descendant of Genghis Khan, Timur rose from obscurity to build a vast empire stretching from Turkey to India. His conquests came at a horrific human cost, as he laid waste to entire cities that resisted his armies. In 1401, Timur sacked Baghdad, the renowned center of Islamic learning. Incensed by the defiance of the Sultan Ahmed Jalayir, who had taken refuge in the city, Timur ordered a general massacre. Some 20,000 civilians were slaughtered in a single day. The great libraries of Baghdad, the intellectual heart of the Muslim world, went up in flames. 2 years later, the cosmopolitan city of Damascus fell to Timur's horde. Again, the conqueror's fury knew no bounds. Artisans were rounded up to be deported to Timur's capital of Samarkand, while the rest faced extermination. Timur's most terrifying atrocity occurred on the Delhi Sultanate campaign of 1398. The Sultan Nasiruddin Mahmud Shah Tughlaq chose to confront Timur's forces in open battle, a catastrophic error of judgment. The Indians were crushed, and a vengeful Timur unleashed hell on the city of Delhi. For 3 days, Timur's soldiers engaged in an orgy of rape, murder, and looting. An estimated 100,000 captives were taken away as slaves. In a chilling display of the conqueror's inhumanity, the severed heads of slain Delhi residents were used to build towering pyramids, a monument to Timur's merciless triumph. Timur's conquests came at an appalling cost in human life and cultural destruction. He was unapologetic in his cruelty, seeing terror as a legitimate weapon of war. The fear Timur instilled was so pervasive that many cities submitted to him without a fight, desperate to avoid the dreadful fate of Baghdad or Damascus. Timur died in 1405 while on a punitive campaign against Ming China, sparing that empire his murderous attentions. He left a legacy drenched in blood, a conqueror whose thirst for power recognized no moral limits. The Wars of the Roses, a protracted dynastic struggle for the English crown, plunged the nation into 3 decades of sporadic civil war in the late 15th century. The conflict pitted 2 rival branches of the royal family, the houses of York and Lancaster, against each other in a series of bloody clashes. Though much of the fighting involved noble factions, the common people of England also suffered terribly. The wars reached a brutal crescendo in 1461 with the Battle of Towton, fought in a snowstorm near York It was the single bloodiest battle ever on English soil. The Yorkist army under Edward IV won a decisive victory, but at a horrific cost. Contemporary accounts claim the battle and subsequent rout left some 28,000 men dead. It was said that Towton's rivers ran red with blood for days afterward. Edward showed no mercy to the defeated Lancastrians. Even men who had sought sanctuary in Towton's churches were dragged out and beheaded on Edward's orders. The most notorious figure of the Wars of the Roses is undoubtedly King Richard III. Though his villainy may be exaggerated by the victorious Tudors who succeeded him, Richard's ruthless actions in seizing and defending the crown are well documented. In 1483, as regent to the 12-year-old Edward V, Richard had the young king and his younger brother declared illegitimate and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The princes in the Tower subsequently disappeared, almost certainly murdered on Richard's command to eliminate rivals to his rule. Richard faced a challenge to his usurped throne from Henry Tudor, a claimant from the Lancastrian line. The matter was settled in August 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. In the thick of the fighting, Richard launched a desperate cavalry charge aimed at Henry's personal standard. He unhorsed the Lancastrian champion Sir John Cheney, but was soon overwhelmed. Attacked on all sides, Richard was driven to the ground and butchered. The victorious Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, founding a dynasty that would transform England. Richard's battered corpse was stripped naked, flung over a horse, and carried to Leicester for an ignominious burial in a humble church. The last English king to die in battle, Richard's savage end embodied the merciless ethos of the Wars of the Roses. The Italian political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli held up Cesare Borgia as a model of the ruthless New Prince in his famous work of Realpolitik. The illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare was a cardinal who abandoned the cloth to pursue naked ambition as a military commander. With his father's backing, he carved out a state for himself in the patchwork of cities and principalities in northern Italy. Cesare was handsome, learned and charismatic, but those qualities disguised a pitiless drive for power. Cesare's defining act of callousness was the murder of his older brother Giovanni in 1497. Giovanni had been the original focus of their father's dynastic schemes, but his arrogance and military failings had begun to grate. When Giovanni turned up dead in suspicious circumstances, Cesare was the prime suspect. Some whispered that Cesare had thrown his brother's corpse into the Tiber. Fratricide was no impediment to Cesare's advance. Now the chief beneficiary of Borgia papal patronage, he redoubled his quest for glory. As Cesare rampaged through the Romagna in 1501 to 1502, no method was too vicious if it secured his goals. He lured the troublesome lords of Senegalia to a meeting under false pretenses, where he had them strangled. When the city of Capua resisted Cesare's French allies, he joined the punitive sacking that saw the defenders massacred and the population terrorized into submission. Machiavelli, then a Florentine diplomat, witnessed Cesare's brutal effectiveness firsthand. He later wrote admiringly that Cesare embodied the lion and the fox, combining raw aggression with sly cunning. Cesare's cruelty was ultimately for naught. His gains depended on his father's influence as pope. When Alexander VI suddenly died in 1503, Cesare's enemies stripped him of all his conquests. Exiled and desperate, Cesare died fighting as a mercenary for the King of Navarre in 1507, aged just 31. The princely epitome of Renaissance individualism had flared across the political firmament, only to be snuffed out when the winds of fortune shifted. Machiavelli's clear-eyed appraisal of Cesare's methods would long outlast him, a primer for tyrants on the utility of terror. The Middle Ages were an era of soaring cathedrals and chivalric ideals, but also of remorseless cruelty visited on the vulnerable. From the fanatical zealotry of the Crusades to the dynastic bloodletting of the Wars of the Roses, powerful figures unleashed misery and destruction on a grand scale. Vlad the Impaler and Cesare Borgia earned enduring infamy as avatars of the age's ruthless spirit, while nameless multitudes suffered and perished in Timur's conquests or the Black Death's horrors. The turmoil of the times could turn even peasants into agents of violent retribution, however doomed their rebellions. We should be wary of seeing the medieval world in simplistic terms of good and evil. Many of the cruelest acts were perpetrated by those who earnestly believed they were doing right, from warrior popes to crusading kings. In a world of fragile life expectancy and the omnipresent threat of war, rulers often felt they had no choice but to use harsh measures to secure their power. The line between hero and villain could be vanishingly thin, as the contested legacy of Richard III attests. Yet even accounting for the standards of the time, the individuals we have examined cross the threshold into exceptional brutality. They were the great raptors of their age, dealing out death and destruction to further their ambitions. Whether aristocratic warlord or anointed monarch, they shared a lust for domination that recognized no transcendent value in human life. As the sun set on another day in medieval Europe, the flickering candlelight illuminated the faces of nobles gathered for a lavish feast. Minstrels played softly in the background, their melodies drifting through the grand hall. But beneath the veneer of courtly manners and chivalric ideals, a darker undercurrent ran through this society. For the Middle Ages were not just a time of gallant knights and fair maidens. They also bore witness to some of the cruelest figures in human history. Among the most notorious of these was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, better known to history as Vlad the Impaler. Born in 1431 in what is now modern-day Romania, Vlad's early life was shaped by the turbulent politics of the Balkans. His father, Vlad II Dracul, navigated a precarious balance between the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the west. As a young boy, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were sent to the Ottoman court as hostages, a common practice at the time to ensure the loyalty of vassal rulers. It was during these formative years in captivity that the seeds of Vlad's cruelty may have first taken root. Subjected to the whims of the Ottoman Sultan, he likely witnessed firsthand the brutal methods used to maintain power in an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Some historians speculate that Vlad's later obsession with impalement as a means of execution may have been inspired by his exposure to this grisly punishment during his time as a hostage. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia and took the throne in 1456, he wasted no time in cementing his reputation as a ruthless and sadistic ruler. He earned his grim moniker, the Impaler, for his preferred method of execution, having victims skewered on sharpened wooden stakes and leaving them to die an agonizing death. Contemporary accounts describe forests of these impaled bodies, numbering in the thousands, left to rot as a warning to anyone who dared oppose him. But impalement was far from the only weapon in Vlad's arsenal of cruelty. He was known to torture his enemies in a variety of horrific ways, from boiling them alive to cutting off their noses, ears, and limbs. One particularly gruesome story tells of how he once invited hundreds of nobles to a banquet, only to have the hall boarded up and set on fire, burning them all alive. Of course, it's worth noting that many of the tales of Vlad's brutality come from sources that were hostile to him, such as the Saxons of Transylvania, whom he frequently fought against. Some historians argue that his actions, while undeniably cruel, were not necessarily out of step with the brutality of the time. In an age when the Ottoman Empire was expanding rapidly and threatening to conquer all of Europe, rulers like Vlad may have felt that extreme measures were necessary to defend their lands and their people. Nevertheless, there is no denying that Vlad the Impaler left an indelible mark on history and popular culture. His bloody deeds would go on to inspire the legend of Dracula, the vampire count created by Bram Stoker in his 1897 novel. But while Stoker's Dracula was a work of fiction, the real-life Vlad was all too terrifyingly real, a testament to the darkness that lurked within the human heart, even in an era celebrated for its chivalry and virtue. As the flames flickered and danced in the hearth, casting long shadows on the stone walls, the nobles continued their feast, blissfully unaware of the horrors that had unfolded in centuries past. For them, Vlad the Impaler was a distant figure, a bogeyman used to frighten unruly children. But for those who had lived under his reign of terror, the scars ran deep, a reminder that even in a time of supposed honor and valor, cruelty could wear many faces. Vlad, however, was far from the only figure to leave a trail of blood and suffering in his wake during the Middle Ages. The Crusades, a series of religious wars waged by European Christians against Muslims in the Holy Land, saw atrocities committed on a staggering scale. It all began in 1095, when Pope Urban II gave a rousing speech at the Council of Clermont, urging the faithful to take up arms and reclaim Jerusalem from the infidels. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of knights, soldiers, and even ordinary peasants flocked to the call, sewing crosses onto their clothes as a sign of their holy mission. But what began as a pious quest quickly descended into a frenzy of violence and bloodshed. As the Crusaders marched east, they left a trail of destruction in their wake, slaughtering Jewish communities in the Rhineland and sacking the great city of Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Christendom. When they finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders unleashed a horrific massacre on the city's inhabitants. Muslim and Jewish men, women, and children were put to the sword, their bodies piled high in the streets. Contemporary accounts describe the conquerors wading through blood up to their ankles, the air thick with the stench of death. It was a scene of unimaginable brutality, all carried out in the name of God and with the blessing of the Church. The Crusades would drag on for nearly 2 centuries, as European armies repeatedly tried and failed to maintain their grip on the Holy Land. Each new campaign brought fresh atrocities, from the sack of Acre in 1104 to the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187. The violence was not limited to the battlefield either. Back in Europe, the Crusades fueled a rising tide of anti-Semitism, with Jewish communities facing persecution, forced conversion, and even mass murder at the hands of crusading mobs. One of the darkest chapters in this history was the Albigensian Crusade, launched by Pope Innocent III in 1209 against the Cathar heretics of southern France. The Cathars were a Christian sect that rejected the authority of the Catholic Church and believed in a dualistic universe of good and evil. To the church hierarchy, they represented a dangerous threat to the established order, one that had to be stamped out at any cost. Over the next 20 years, the Crusaders waged a brutal campaign of terror against the Cathars and their supporters. Whole towns and villages were put to the torch, their inhabitants slaughtered without mercy. At the notorious massacre of Béziers in 1209, the papal legate Arnaud Amalric allegedly declared, "Kill them all, God will know his own." A chilling sentiment that would come to define the savagery of the crusade. By the time the last Cathar stronghold fell in 1229, the once vibrant culture of southern France lay in ruins. The Albigensian Crusade had not only decimated the Cathar heresy, but also paved the way for the expansion of royal power and the infamous Inquisition that would terrorize Europe for centuries to come. It was a grim reminder of the terrible price paid by those who dared to challenge the authority of the Church in the Middle Ages. As the embers burned low in the hearth and the minstrels' songs faded into the night, the nobles began to drift off to their chambers. their minds heavy with the weight of history. For all the grandeur and pageantry of their world, they knew that it was built on a foundation of blood and suffering, the legacy of the cruelest people in medieval history. And as they lay their heads down to sleep, they could only hope that the demons of the past would not come back to haunt them in their dreams. The Albigensian Crusade was a brutal campaign launched by Pope Innocent III in 1209 to eliminate the Cathar heresy in Languedoc, a region in southern France. The Cathars were a Christian sect that rejected the authority of the Catholic Church, believing in a dualistic theology that saw the material world as evil and corrupt. They preached a life of simplicity and poverty, winning many converts among the local populace. To the Pope and the French monarchy, however, the Cathars represented a dangerous threat to the established order. Innocent III declared them heretics and called for a crusade to exterminate them, offering the same spiritual rewards granted to crusaders in the Holy Land. A large army of French knights and mercenaries, led by the notorious Simon de Montfort, descended upon Languedoc, laying waste to the countryside. The Crusaders showed no mercy to the Cathars or their supporters. In the town of Béziers, when asked how to distinguish between Catholics and heretics, the papal legate Arnaud Amalric allegedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." The entire population of the town, some 20,000 men, women and children, were massacred in the church where they had sought refuge. Similar atrocities occurred throughout the region as the Crusaders systematically destroyed Cathar villages and strongholds. Captured heretics who refused to recant their beliefs were burned at the stake. The Cathar faith was virtually extinguished, their culture and language suppressed. The Albigensian Crusade left a deep scar on the psyche of southern France. It marked a turning point in the consolidation of royal power and the authority of the Catholic Church. The Inquisition that followed targeted any remaining Cathars, driving the movement underground. The last known Cathar perfect, Guillaume Bellibaste, was burned alive in 1321, bringing an end to a shameful chapter in medieval history. Beyond the religious persecution of heretics like the Cathars, the Middle Ages were notorious for the cruel and gruesome forms of torture and execution inflicted upon criminals and political enemies. Public executions were a common spectacle, drawing large crowds eager for morbid entertainment. Burning at the stake was a particularly horrific fate reserved for those convicted of heresy or witchcraft. The victims, often women, were tied to a wooden post surrounded by bundles of wood. As the flames were lit, the condemned would suffer an agonizingly slow and painful death, their screams echoing through the streets. Another torture device, the breaking wheel, was used to punish criminals in medieval France and Germany. The victim's limbs were tied to a large wooden wheel, which was then slowly rotated while the executioner smashed the exposed bones with an iron bar. This process could be repeated for hours, prolonging the torment before finally delivering a fatal blow called the coup de grâce. In England, the punishment for treason was the infamous hanging, drawing and quartering. The condemned man would first be hanged until nearly dead, then cut down and disemboweled while still alive. His entrails were burned before him as he watched. Finally, his body would be cut into 4 pieces, or quartered, and the parts sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom as a warning to others. These brutal methods were not just about punishment, but also about sending a message and instilling terror. They served as a public reminder of the consequences of defying those in power, whether religious or secular authorities. The cruel ingenuity of these tortures and executions speaks to a certain medieval mentality that often valued retribution and intimidation over justice and mercy. One English king particularly associated with such cruelty and abuse of power was King John, the youngest son of Henry II. Though he is perhaps best known for being the villain in the Robin Hood legends, forced to sign the Magna Carta by his rebellious barons, His real-life villainy was even more shocking. John was said to be a spiteful, petty tyrant with a vicious temper. Early in his reign, he managed to lose most of the English crown's lands in France, including Normandy, due to military incompetence and alienating his own vassals. This led to a rebellion by a group of powerful barons in England, plunging the kingdom into civil war. John responded to this threat with his customary brutality. He took a number of the rebel barons prisoner and executed them personally, starving some to death in his dungeons. He was also rumoured to have murdered his own nephew and rival claimant to the throne, Arthur of Brittany. Though the truth of this accusation remains uncertain, what is clear is that John's actions made him hugely unpopular with his subjects. He was seen as a cowardly, dishonourable king who failed to live up to the chivalric ideals of the age. His humiliating defeat by the French and his cruel treatment of his own people led to a complete collapse in his support. When the barons finally cornered him and forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, limiting royal power and enshrining certain rights, few of his subjects mourned. Despite this check on his authority, John spent his remaining years trying to wriggle out of the Magna Carta's provisions and re-establish his own despotic rule. He might have succeeded, plunging England back into tyranny, had he not died suddenly of dysentery in 1216 on campaign against the rebellious barons and their French allies. John's ignominious end was a fitting symbol of his disastrous reign, characterized by a toxic blend of incompetence, spite, and wanton cruelty. Nowhere were the sufferings of the common people in the Middle Ages more acute than during the era of the great peasant revolts of the 14th century. A perfect storm of famine, plague, and war had left the lower classes more impoverished and oppressed than ever, while the nobility continued to live in luxury and excess. The first major eruption of peasant anger came in France in 1358, during the early stages of the 100 Years' War with England. With the French king, Jean II, captured by the English at the Battle of Poitiers, and the kingdom in chaos, a group of peasants and townsfolk rose up in the Jacquerie Revolt, named for their leader Jacques Bonhomme, or Simple Jack. The Jacquerie was marked by its ferocity and indiscriminate violence. The rebels, armed with little more than farming tools and makeshift weapons, attacked noble estates and castles, burning and pillaging as they went. They targeted the nobility and clergy in particular, seeing them as the source of their oppression and misery. However, the nobles soon regrouped and launched a brutal counterattack. The untrained and poorly equipped peasant mobs were no match for the heavily armed and mounted knights. The revolt was crushed mercilessly, with the rebels slaughtered en masse. Jacques Bonhomme himself was captured and gruesomely executed, his body torn apart by horses. A similar fate awaited the participants in the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Sparked by a combination of heavy taxation, the ravages of the Black Death, and resentment of the feudal system, the revolt saw tens of thousands of peasants and labourers march on London under the leadership of Wat Tyler. Initially, the young King Richard II agreed to meet with the rebels and hear their demands, which included the abolition of serfdom and a general pardon. However, during a heated confrontation at Smithfield, Tyler was suddenly attacked and killed by the Lord Mayor of London, leading to an armed standoff. Richard, though only 14 years old, showed remarkable composure and cunning. He promised the leaderless rebels that he would meet their demands if they dispersed peacefully. Once they had gone, however, he reneged on his word and launched a wave of reprisals. The leading rebels were hunted down, hanged, and quartered, while the rest were forced back into servitude. The failure of these revolts illustrates the near impossible odds faced by medieval peasants in trying to change their lot. Despite their numerical strength, they lacked the organization, resources, and leadership to effectively challenge the entrenched power of the nobility and clergy. The vicious repression that followed each uprising only served to reinforce the rigid social hierarchy of the age. As a result, the peasantry remained largely powerless and oppressed throughout the Middle Ages, toiling in the fields and serving their masters with little hope of relief or redress. The dream of a more just and equitable society would have to wait for future generations to take up the fight. In the late 14th century, a new terror emerged from the steppes of Central Asia to devastate the Islamic world and beyond. Timur, known to history as Tamerlane or Timur the Lame, was a Turco-Mongol conqueror who sought to rebuild the empire of Genghis Khan. In the process, he carved a bloody path across Eurasia, leaving behind piles of skulls and ruined cities as monuments to his brutality. Born into a minor clan in what is now Uzbekistan, Timur rose to power through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and sheer ruthlessness. He first established his authority over the Chagatai Khanate, a Mongol successor state in Central Asia, before launching a series of conquests that would make him the master of a vast empire stretching from Russia to India. Timur's methods were as cruel as they were effective. He was notorious for the practice of building towers of skulls from the remains of his defeated enemies, a gruesome display meant to strike terror into the hearts of those who might resist him. When he captured the city of Isfahan in Persia, he ordered the massacre of 70,000 inhabitants, their heads stacked into pyramids. One of Timur's most brutal campaigns was his invasion of India in 1398. Marching through the Khyber Pass with a huge army, he descended upon the Delhi Sultanate, then one of the richest and most powerful states in the Islamic world. The Sultan, Nasir-ud-Din Mahmud Shah Tughlaq, hastily assembled a force to meet him, but was outmaneuvered and crushed in battle. Timur then unleashed his troops on the city of Delhi itself. For 3 days, they engaged in an orgy of looting, rape, and slaughter, killing tens of thousands of civilians. The city was left a smoking ruin, its palaces and mosques reduced to rubble, its population decimated. It was a blow from which the Delhi Sultanate would never fully recover. Timur's later campaigns saw him sack Baghdad, Damascus, and Aleppo, leaving a trail of destruction across the Middle East. He even defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, who had been previously invincible, at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, capturing the Sultan himself. Bayezid would die in captivity a year later, humiliated and broken. Despite his ferocity, Timur also styled himself as a patron of the arts and sciences. He made his capital of Samarkand into a glittering center of culture and learning, attracting scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the Islamic world. Beautiful mosques, madrasas, and gardens sprang up, adorned with intricate tilework and calligraphy. But this cultural flowering was built on a foundation of blood and terror. Timur's conquests were estimated to have caused the deaths of some 17 million people, or about 5% of the world's population at the time. He embodied the archetype of the cruel and despotic Oriental ruler, ruling through fear and violence rather than justice and mercy. When Timur died on campaign in 1405, his empire quickly fractured as his descendants fought over the spoils. But his legend lived on, inspiring both admiration and revulsion in equal measure. To some, he was a great warrior and empire builder, the last of the nomadic conquerors in the tradition of Genghis Khan. To others, he was a monster, a scourge upon humanity whose cruelty knew no bounds. In the end, Timur's legacy is one of ambiguity, a reminder of the strange allure that tyrants and conquerors have always held over the human imagination. His story is a dark reflection of the medieval world at its most grim and unforgiving, a time when life was often nasty, brutish, and short, and power belonged to those ruthless enough to seize it by any means necessary. From the blood-soaked fields of France to the burning plains of India, the Middle Ages were an era of unrelenting conflict and war. But few struggles were as bitter or as destructive as the Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic civil wars that tore England apart in the latter half of the 15th century. The roots of the conflict lay in the weak and ineffectual rule of King Henry VI, who had inherited the throne as a child and grown into a pious but feeble-minded adult. Henry's failures as a ruler, including the loss of England's territories in France and his own mental breakdown, led to growing discontent among the nobility. Two rival branches of the royal family, the houses of Lancaster and York, began to vie for control of the government. The Lancastrians, led by Henry's formidable queen, Margaret of Anjou, sought to protect the king's authority and their own power. The Yorkists, under the charismatic Richard, Duke of York, aimed to depose Henry and take the throne for themselves. The first blow was struck in 1455, when Richard of York and his ally, the Earl of Warwick, defeated the Lancastrians at the First Battle of St. Albans, killing several of their leaders. This marked the beginning of a long and bloody struggle that would see the crown change hands several times as each side gained and lost the upper hand. The battles of the Wars of the Roses were among the most brutal and hard-fought of the Middle Ages. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, some 28,000 men were killed in a single day of savage hand-to-hand combat in the driving snow. The dead were piled so high that they formed a grisly wall across the battlefield. The Yorkists initially seemed to have won the war when their leader, Edward IV, seized the throne in 1461. But the Lancastrians refused to submit, and fighting continued sporadically for another decade. In 1470, Warwick, now estranged from Edward, defected to the Lancastrian side and briefly restored Henry VI to the throne. Edward soon returned from exile, however, and defeated Warwick and the Lancastrians at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury in 1471. The Lancastrian heir, Edward of Westminster, was killed in the fighting, while Henry VI himself was murdered shortly thereafter, allegedly on Edward's orders. But the Wars of the Roses were not yet over. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, his young sons, the princes in the Tower, disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leading to rumours that they had been murdered by their uncle, Richard III, who had seized the throne for himself. Richard's short and turbulent reign was marked by further plotting and betrayal. In 1485, he was challenged by Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the Lancastrian kings, who had gained the support of disaffected Yorkists. The two sides met at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Richard, fighting bravely to the end, was cut down and killed. Henry Tudor was crowned as Henry VII, founding a new dynasty that would rule England for more than a century. But the wounds of the Wars of the Roses would take generations to heal. The English nobility had been decimated, with many great families wiped out or ruined. The crown itself had been tarnished by the spectacle of kings being deposed and murdered by their own kin. The Wars of the Roses remain a byword for the destructive power of unchecked ambition and the perils of weak and divided rule. They remind us of the fragility of even the most seemingly stable political order and the terrible price that can be paid when the bonds of loyalty and kinship break down. In the end, it was not just the kings and nobles who suffered, but the common people of England, caught up in a conflict that brought them only misery and death. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, Italy was a land of contrasts, home to some of the most brilliant artists, scholars, and statesmen of the Renaissance, but also to some of the most notorious tyrants and schemers. Among the latter, few were as infamous or as feared as Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, and a cardinal turned warlord. Born into the scandalous and power-hungry Borgia family, Cesare was groomed for a career in the church from a young age. But his true talents lay in statecraft and war, not in the priesthood. With the help of his father, he secured a release from his ecclesiastical vows and embarked on a ruthless campaign to carve out a kingdom for himself in central Italy. As captain general of the papal armies, Cesare proved himself a skilled and ambitious military leader. He conquered the city of Imola and the fortress of Forli, brutally executing their rulers and seizing their lands. He then turned his attention to the Romagna region, subduing its fractious lords and bringing them under his own iron rule. But Cesare's rise to power was marked by treachery and bloodshed. He was widely suspected of having his own brother Juan murdered in order to eliminate a rival for their father's favor. He also had several of his enemies strangled or poisoned, including his brother-in-law Alfonso of Aragon, whom he regarded as a threat to his own position. Cesare's methods were as cunning as they were cruel. He would often lure. As the 15th century dawned, a figure emerged in Italy who would come to embody the ruthless ambition and cunning of the age: Cesare Borgia. Born into power and privilege as the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare was destined for a career in the church. Appointed a cardinal at the age of 18, he cut a dashing figure in his scarlet robes, his handsome face framed by flowing dark hair. But beneath the polished veneer lurked a soul consumed by a lust for power and glory. The young cardinal chafed at the constraints of his religious office, yearning to carve out a kingdom of his own in the patchwork of city-states and principalities that made up Renaissance Italy. An opportunity presented itself in 1498 when his younger brother Juan, the Pope's favorite and a rival for power, was murdered in Rome. Rumors swirled that Cesare himself was behind the assassination, having grown jealous of Juan's military commands and favor with their father. Now unencumbered by fraternal rivalry, Cesare set his sights on a new path to power and renounced his cardinalate. With the Pope's backing, he maneuvered to marry Charlotte d'Albret, sister of the King of Navarre, in order to secure a title and a base for his ambitions. The wedding was a sumptuous affair, the bride bedecked in jewels and the groom resplendent in gold brocade. But it was a mere stepping stone for Cesare, his eyes fixed on a greater prize: dominion over central Italy. As the new Duke of Valentinois, Cesare gathered an army and set out to conquer the Romagna, a region of independent city-states nominally under papal control. With a combination of duplicity, bribery, and outright force, he brought the cities of Imola, Forli, and Faenza to heel. The brutality of his methods was shocking even by the standards of the day. In the town of Capua, he ordered the murder of Astorre, the third Manfredi, the young lord who had surrendered to him, and had his body thrown in the Tiber. Machiavelli, then a diplomat from Florence, looked on with a mixture of horror and fascination. He would later enshrine Cesare as the archetypal new prince in his famous treatise, seeing in him a model of the immoral pragmatism required for successful statecraft. For all his undoubted abilities as a commander and politician, Machiavelli wrote, Cesare's ultimate failure was his reliance on the fickle goodwill of others, especially his father the Pope. Indeed, it was Alexander's sudden death in 1503 that proved Cesare's undoing. The new Pope, Julius II, was determined to curtail the Borgia power and demanded the return of Cesare's conquests. Beset by enemies on all sides, his mercenary armies melting away, Cesare was forced to surrender. Exiled to Spain, he schemed fruitlessly to regain his lost dominions until his death in battle in 1507, aged only 31. Cesare's dazzling rise and precipitous fall was in many ways emblematic of the age, a time of dizzying social mobility when a man of talent and ruthless ambition could aspire to greatness, only to be brought low by the capricious winds of fortune. His legacy would endure not in any lasting political achievement, but in the pages of Machiavelli's Prince, a work that casts a long shadow over political thought to this day. For all his unscrupulous villainy, there remains something darkly compelling about the figure of Cesare Borgia, the handsome young cardinal who dreamed of crowns, the swashbuckling condottiero who carved out a kingdom by the sword. His brilliance and his brutality, his soaring ambition and ultimate failure continue to fascinate us even half a millennium later. But Cesare was far from alone in his cruelty. The Italian Renaissance, for all its glories of art and learning, was also an age of shocking violence and immorality among the ruling classes. From the bloody feuds of the Guelphs and Ghibellines to the intrigues of the Sforzas and Medicis, Italy's history is littered with figures every bit as ruthless as Cesare Borgia. And beyond the Alps, Europe's monarchs were scarcely less brutal. The England of the Wars of the Roses saw countless nobles butchered in a relentless dynastic struggle, while in Spain, the terrors of the Inquisition were gathering pace. Even in Cesare's lifetime, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II was cementing his rule with fratricide, having his brother strangled to remove a potential rival claimant. The uncomfortable truth is that for most of human history, cruelty and violence have been the norm rather than the exception for those in power. The absolute monarchs and warrior aristocrats of old were often pitiless in their pursuit of their own interests, untroubled by the suffering they inflicted on those below them. It's a sobering realization as we cast our minds back to those distant times, trying to make sense of lives and worldviews so alien to our own. The past, as they say, is a foreign country, and as we wander through its strange and shadowed landscapes, we are forced to confront the darkest recesses of the human heart. The cruelty of men like Cesare Borgia stands as a bleak reminder of how far we have come and how far we still have to go. And yet, even in the depths of the Middle Ages, there were glimmers of light amidst the darkness, voices of conscience and compassion that spoke out against the tide of brutality. Men like St. Francis of Assisi, who renounced wealth and embraced poverty and humility, or the visionary mystic Hildegard of Bingen, who fearlessly rebuked emperors and popes alike. Their example reminds us that even in the most benighted of times, the human spirit is never wholly extinguished, that in every age there are those who strive to uphold the ideals of justice, mercy, and peace, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against them. As we reflect on the cruelest figures of the Middle Ages, the tyrants and torturers, the warlords and inquisitors, we are called to ponder the eternal question of human nature itself. What is it that leads some to such heights of ruthlessness and barbarity, while others are moved by conscience to resist? There are no easy answers, but perhaps in wrestling with such questions, we can begin to shape a world in which the Cesare Borgias of our own time find it ever harder to flourish. A world where cruelty is met not with indifference or acquiescence, but with the fierce and unyielding resistance of those who believe in the dignity of every human soul. The Middle Ages may seem to us now like a distant and alien realm, wreathed in the mists of time, but in the lives and deeds of those long-dead men and women, we can still hear the echoes of our common humanity. The same hopes and fears, the same dreams and despairs that move us to this day. In the end, perhaps the true lesson of history is simply this, that for all the cruelty and brutality of the past, the human spirit endures. That even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of redemption, of grace, of a better world to come. It is a lesson that we would do well to remember as we navigate the challenges and uncertainties of our own time. For though the faces and names may change, the fundamental struggle between light and darkness, between compassion and cruelty, remains the same. And it falls to each of us, in our own way, to take up the torch that has been passed down through the generations, to stand firm against the Cesare Borgias of our world, and to strive always for a future in which mercy and justice may prevail. As we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, let us hold fast to that hope, the hope that even in the darkest of nights, the dawn will come, that the better angels of our nature will guide us through the shadows and lead us at last into the light. As we delve deeper into the life and legacy of Cesare Borgia, it's important to understand the political landscape of Italy during the Renaissance. The peninsula was divided into a patchwork of city-states, each vying for power and influence. In this cutthroat environment, the Borgia family rose to prominence through a combination of shrewd political maneuvering, strategic marriages, and ruthless ambition. Cesare Borgia was born into this world of intrigue in 1475, the illegitimate son of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI. From a young age, Cesare was groomed for a life in the church, and by the age of 15, he was already a bishop. However, it soon became clear that Cesare's true talents lay not in the spiritual realm, but in the art of war and statecraft. In 1493, Cesare's father ascended to the papal throne, taking the name Alexander VI. As Pope, Alexander used his position to further the interests of his family, and Cesare was one of the chief beneficiaries of his father's nepotism. He was appointed as a cardinal and given command of the papal armies, despite having no prior military experience. But what Cesare lacked in experience, he made up for in sheer ruthlessness and cunning. He quickly set about consolidating his power in central Italy, launching a series of brutal military campaigns against the city-states of Romagna. His tactics were notoriously harsh. He would often massacre the inhabitants of conquered cities and display their severed heads as a warning to others who might resist his rule. One of the most infamous episodes in Cesare's rise to power was the murder of his own brother, Giovanni Borgia, in 1497. Giovanni was a rival for their father's affections and a potential threat to Cesare's ambitions. One night, Giovanni's body was fished out of the Tiber River, riddled with stab wounds. While the identity of his killer was never conclusively proven, it was widely believed that Cesare was behind the assassination. Despite the brutal nature of his rule, Cesare was not without his admirers. The Renaissance philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli, who served as a diplomat to the Borgia court, saw in Cesare the embodiment of the ideal prince, a ruler who was willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. In his famous work, The Prince, Machiavelli would later hold up Cesare as a model for other aspiring rulers to follow. But even the most ruthless of princes are not immune to the vicissitudes of fate. In 1503, Cesare's father died suddenly, leaving him without the protection of the papacy. His enemies, sensing weakness, quickly moved against him. Cesare was arrested and exiled to Spain, where he would spend the remaining years of his life in obscurity. Despite his ignominious end, the legacy of Cesare Borgia looms large in the annals of history. He is remembered as one of the most notorious figures of the Renaissance, a man who embodied both the brilliance and the brutality of the age. His story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrupting influence of power. As we come to the end of our exploration of the cruelest people in medieval history, it's worth reflecting on what these stories can teach us about the human condition. Throughout the Middle Ages, we see the same themes emerge again and again: the lust for power, the capacity for cruelty, and the toll that these can take on the lives of ordinary people. Yet even in the darkest moments of history, there are glimmers of light. For every Vlad the Impaler or Cesare Borgia, there were countless others who fought against tyranny and oppression, who sought to build a world based on justice and compassion. It is these stories, too, that we must remember as we look back on the medieval world. So, as we close this chapter on the cruelest people in medieval history, let us do so with a sense of perspective. While it is important to acknowledge the darkness of the past, it is equally important to recognize the progress that we have made as a species. We still have a long way to go in building a world free from cruelty and oppression, but by learning from the lessons of history we can take steps towards a brighter future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the darker corners of the medieval world. I hope that you have found it both informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to support more content like this. And may you rest easy, knowing that the cruelest people in history are but a distant memory, and that the future is ours to shape. Good night.